Hey there, and welcome to Beyond the Veil. I'm here to help you drift off into a peaceful sleep, offering soothing stories and gentle guidance. Before we settle into dreamland, let me know in the comments, which country are you from? And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more restful nights.
The neon glow of soul bled into the pre-dawn sky, a hazy orange halo clinging to the edges of the city's sprawling landscape. Beneath the shimmering facade of modern Korea, a different world thrived, a clandestine network of urban explorers, drawn to the forbidden whispers of forgotten places. They called themselves Night Stalkers, and their currency was adrenaline, their maps drawn with shadows and rumors. Within this subculture, one legend stood apart, a chilling tale whispered in hushed tones around flickering campfires, the story of the abandoned Kumho apartment tower. Rising like a skeletal finger from the heart of the city's older district, the Kumho Tower was a monument to broken dreams, a concrete husk left unfinished after a series of financial collapses and unsettling accidents. But it wasn't just the building's grim history that drew the Night Stalkers. It was the elevator game. A ritual, some called it a dare, others claimed the rules were simple. Deceptively sewed out a specific sequence of floor visits in the building's sole, still functioning elevator, performed precisely, was said to open a doorway to somewhere else. The whispers spoke of floors that shouldn't exist, levels missing from the architect's plans, warped realities accessible only through the elevator's strange dance. More disturbing were the stories of those who had attempted the game and returned. Changed disappearances lasting hours, sometimes days, followed by reappearances with vacant eyes and fragmented memories. They couldn't recall what happened, only a pervasive sense of wrongness, a feeling of having been somewhere. One explorer, a young woman known only as Raven, had been found wandering the streets near the tower, her clothes torn, muttering about impossible geometries and a presence that watched from the shadows. Another, a seasoned veteran named Ghost, simply vanished. After entering the tower, leaving behind only his camera, its last image a distorted view of the elevator's control panel, the rumors painted a terrifying picture, a gateway to another dimension, a playground for something malevolent, a glitch in the fabric of reality accessible through a simple, yet terrifying, game. And tonight, 3 more souls were drawn to the Kumho Tower, ready to test the legend. To face the darkness, and perhaps, to disappear forever. Their names were Liam, Sarah, and Jean Wu, and they were about to learn the true meaning of fear. Liam, the self-proclaimed leader of their little expedition, adjusted the strap of his backpack, his expression a mask of calculated indifference. Beneath the facade, however, a tremor of anticipation, bordering on fear, ran through him. He considered himself a pragmatist, a skeptic, drawn to the Kumho Tower not by the whispers of the supernatural, but by the challenge, the puzzle of it all. He needed to see for himself if there was anything to the rumors, or if it was all just urban legend amplified by internet echo chambers. Years of urban exploration had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were screaming at him to turn around, but he wouldn't. He couldn't. Trailing behind Liam was Sarah, the group's documentarian. Her camera, a high-end Sony Alpha, was already humming, recording every detail of their approach. Sarah wasn't driven by skepticism or a need for answers, she was an adrenaline junkie. Pure and simple, the Kumho Tower, the elevator game, the stories of disappearances, it was all content, raw material for her burgeoning YouTube channel. She craved the thrill of the unknown, the potential for capturing something truly extraordinary, something that would catapult her into internet stardom. She imagined the views, the comments, the sponsorships, the risk. For her, was part of the appeal. The darker, the better. Bringing up the rear was Jean Wu, their local guide. He was the quietest of the 3, a young man with a haunted look in his eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of the city's hidden history. He had grown up in the shadow of the Kumho Tower, listening to the stories passed down through generations of his family, stories of misfortune, of strange occurrences, of a dark energy that permeated the building's very foundations that he claimed to know the true history of the tower. The secrets that the developers had tried to bury. Jin-woo wasn't there for the thrill, or the fame, or even the answers. That he was there out of a sense of obligation, a feeling that he had a responsibility to understand the tower, to protect it, or perhaps, to appease whatever forces resided within. He clutched a small, intricately carved wooden charm in his pocket, a talisman passed down from his grandmother, said to ward off evil spirits. He hoped it would be enough. He feared it wouldn't. Liam's skepticism, Sarah's recklessness, and his own quiet dread formed an uneasy alliance as they approached the looming silhouette of the Kumho Tower. Each of them carried their own reasons for being there, their own hopes and fears, unaware of the true horrors that awaited them within. Before even setting foot near the Kumho Tower, Liam had insisted on thorough research. He treated the expedition like a scientific inquiry, meticulously gathering every scrap of information he could find. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, focused on the practicalities, backup generators, first aid kits, and enough batteries to power a small city. Jin-woo, meanwhile, delved into the esoteric, poring over ancient texts and local folklore. The history of the Kumho Tower was a tapestry woven with misfortune and tragedy. Construction had begun in the late 1980s, during South Korea's rapid economic boom. Ambitious plans called for a luxurious residential complex, a symbol of the nation's newfound prosperity, but the project was plagued by problems from the start. Rumors circulated about cost-cutting measures, substandard materials, and corner-cutting that compromised the building's structural integrity. Then came the accidents. A construction worker fell to his death from the upper floors. A fire broke out, fueled by faulty wiring, claiming several more lives, and then, the financial crisis of the late 1990s struck, crippling the project and leaving the tower unfinished, a concrete skeleton looming over the city. Officially, the tower was abandoned due to financial reasons and structural concerns, but Jin-woo's research revealed a darker narrative. He uncovered stories of shamanistic rituals performed on the construction site, intended to appease the land spirits. These rituals were said to have been disrupted, angering the spirits and cursing the tower. The elevator game itself was a convoluted set of instructions, variations of which could be found scattered across online forums and cryptic websites. The most common version involved pressing a specific sequence of buttons, for -2-6-2-10-5, then exiting the elevator on the 5th floor. If successful, the elevator would supposedly ascend to the 10th floor without anyone inside, and upon its return, a different woman would enter. This was the signal that the game had begun. Further instructions detailed the steps to reach the other floors, the floors that shouldn't exist. Local warnings were plentiful, though often dismissed as superstition. Elderly residents living near the tower spoke of strange occurrences, flickering lights, unexplained noises, and a palpable sense of unease that permeated the area. They warned against entering the tower, claiming it was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place where the living could easily cross over to the realm of the dead. Liam, despite his skepticism, couldn't completely dismiss the sheer volume of warnings. Sarah saw them as good promotional material for her documentary. Jin-woo felt a growing sense of dread, convinced that they were walking into something far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. The rusted metal door groaned in protest as Liam forced it open, the sound echoing through the cavernous lobby. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, a suffocating reminder of the tower's abandonment. Dust motes danced in the beams of their flashlights, illuminating peeling paint, shattered glass, and graffiti that stretched like grotesque vines across the walls. Sarah, ever the documentarian, swept her camera across the scene, narrating for her future viewers. "Welcome to the Kumho Tower," she announced, her voice echoing eerily. "As you can see, folks, this place is seriously messed up, definitely worth the trip." Liam shot her a withering glance. Jin-woo remained silent, his eyes scanning the shadows, his hands still clutching the wooden charm in his pocket. The elevator, miraculously, was still functional. Its interior was a cramped, claustrophobic space, lined with scratched metal and flickering fluorescent lights. The buttons were worn and faded, but still legible. Liam consulted the instructions for the elevator game, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Okay," he said, "let's try this point 4-2-6-2-10-5. Everyone ready?" They followed the sequence precisely, the elevator lurching and groaning as it ascended and descended. They exited on the 5th floor, as instructed, waiting for the elevator to return. Nothing. They waited for several minutes, the silence broken only by the hum of the elevator's machinery and the frantic beating of Jean Woo's heart. Finally, the elevator doors slid open. Empty. No different woman. Just an empty, decaying elevator. "Well, that's disappointing," Sarah said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Guess the ghost lady called in sick today." Liam remained unfazed. "It's just a game," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "There are probably variations, different sequences. We'll try again." They spent the next hour repeating the sequence, trying different variations, consulting different online sources. Each attempt yielded the same result: nothing. The elevator behaved normally, transporting them between floors, but nothing out of the ordinary occurred. Doubt began to creep in, even for Sarah. The initial thrill of exploration began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of frustration. "Are you sure this is even real?" Sarah asked, her voice losing its earlier enthusiasm. "Maybe it's just a hoax, a bunch of internet garbage." Liam, despite his skepticism, felt a pang of disappointment. He had hoped, at least secretly, that there was something to the legend. Jean Woo, however, seemed almost relieved. "Maybe," he said quietly, "the spirits don't want to be disturbed." But even as he spoke those words, a cold shiver ran down his spine. That he had a feeling that they weren't alone, that something was watching them from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Just as Liam was about to declare the whole thing a bust, ready to pack up their gear and head home, something shifted. They were mid-sequence, punching in the numbers almost mechanically at this point. For -2-6-2-10-5. The elevator groaned as usual, but this time, instead of smoothly ascending, it shuddered violently, the lights flickering erratically. A high-pitched whine emanated from the machinery, a sound that grated on their nerves. Then, it stopped, not at a designated floor, but somewhere in between. The floor indicator above the door displayed a jumbled mess of numbers and symbols, indecipherable and nonsensical. Liam frowned. "That's not right," he said, consulting the blueprints he had downloaded onto his phone. "There's no floor there. It's just supposed to be empty space, the elevator shaft." Sarah, her earlier boredom replaced with a renewed sense of excitement, pushed forward, camera raised. "Well, let's see what's behind door number, whatever that is." Jean Woo, however, recoiled, his face pale. "Don't," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." Liam, despite his skepticism, hesitated. He trusted his instincts, and his instincts were screaming at him to stay put. But the lure of the unknown, the desire to solve the puzzle, was too strong to resist. He pressed the button to open the doors. With a drawn-out screech, the doors slowly slid apart, revealing a scene that defied logic and reason. It was a floor of the Kumho Tower, or at least, something that resembled one. The hallway stretched before them, but it was twisted and distorted, as if viewed through a funhouse mirror. The walls were at unnatural angles, the ceiling sloped downwards, and the floor seemed to undulate beneath their feet. The lighting was strange, an unnatural, sickly green glow that emanated from unseen sources. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something indescribably foul and rotten. But the most disturbing thing was the repetition. Doors lined the hallway, identical doors, stretching into the distance, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of identical rooms within, rooms filled with dusty, overturned furniture, flickering television screens, and shadowy figures that seemed to shift and writhe in the periphery. It was as if the tower had been copied and pasted, a glitch in the matrix, a broken record stuck on repeat. This wasn't just an abandoned building, this was something else entirely. This was wrong, this was impossible. This was the beginning of their nightmare. Sarah, her eyes gleaming with manic excitement, didn't hesitate. The distorted reality before them was the content she had been craving, the footage that would make her a star. "This is it, guys," she exclaimed, already stepping out of the elevator, camera whirring. "This is what we came for." Liam reached out to stop her, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. "Sarah, wait, we don't know what's out there. We should stick together." But she was already gone, venturing into the hallway, her flashlight beam cutting through the sickly green gloom. "Don't worry, Liam, I'll be fine, just getting some establishing shots. You guys coming or what?" Jin Woo, his face ashen, shook his head vehemently. "No, I'm staying here, this place. It's not right that we need to leave, now." Liam glanced at Jin Woo, then back at Sarah, who was already halfway down the hallway, filming everything with feverish intensity. He sighed that he couldn't just leave her out there alone, even if every instinct in his body was telling him to stay put. "All right, Jin Woo, stay here," Liam said, grabbing his own flashlight. "Keep the doors opened. We'll be right back." He stepped out of the elevator, his hand hovering over the button to keep the doors from closing. He took a few tentative steps into the hallway, the distorted perspective making him feel disoriented and nauseous. "Sarah, don't go too far," he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the warped space. He turned back to check on Jin Woo, but in that brief moment, everything changed. With a sudden, jarring lurch, the elevator doors slammed shut. Liam whirled around, his heart pounding in his chest. "Jin Woo, what the hell?" He frantically pressed the button to recall the elevator, but nothing happened. The doors remained stubbornly closed, the floor indicator displaying the same jumbled mess of symbols. He pounded on the doors, yelling Jin Woo's name, but there was no response, only silence, broken by the faint, distorted sounds of Sarah's camera whirring in the distance. He was trapped on a floor that shouldn't exist, with no way back. And Sarah was out there, alone. He continued to hammer on the doors, his frustration turning to panic. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, he heard a faint click, the doors shuttered, then slowly began to slide open, but instead of Jin Woo's relieved face, he was met with an empty elevator, the air inside thick with a cold, oppressive silence. Jin Woo was gone, and Sarah was still out there, somewhere in the twisted labyrinth of the impossible floor. Liam stood frozen, staring into the empty elevator shaft, his mind reeling. Jin Woo gone, vanished without a trace. He had to find Sarah. He had to get them both out of this nightmare. Taking a deep breath, he stepped back into the hallway, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive gloom. "Sarah," he yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Only silence answered him, the distorted echoes of his own voice bouncing off the warped walls. He started down the hallway, checking each of the identical doors, his heart pounding with each step. The rooms were all the same, overturned furniture, flickering television screens showing static, and those shadowy figures lurking in the corners, always just out of sight. He called Sarah's name again and again, his voice growing hoarse. He felt like he was wandering through a maze, a labyrinth designed to drive him mad. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps it was only minutes. He couldn't tell anymore. The distorted perspective, the oppressive atmosphere, the constant repetition, it was all starting to wear him down. Just as he was about to succumb to despair, he heard it. A faint sound, like a sob, coming from one of the rooms that he rushed towards it. His flashlight beam trembling that he pushed open the door, and there she was, Sarah. She was huddled in a corner, her camera lying on the floor beside her. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her face streaked with tears. She was mumbling incoherently, rocking back and forth. "Sarah, it's me, Liam, what happened?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with terror. "Liam," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't remember that. I don't know where I am, that I don't know how long I've been here." He helped her to her feet, noticing that her clothes were torn and dirty. She seemed disoriented, confused, like she was waking up from a bad dream. That he led her back to the elevator, his arm around her shoulders. The elevator doors were still open, the interior still empty. That he helped Sarah inside and frantically pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator shuddered and began to descend. The jumbled symbols on the floor indicator slowly replaced by recognizable numbers. As they reached the ground floor and the doors slid open, Sarah stumbled out, blinking in the relatively normal lighting of the lobby. She looked around, her expression blank. What happened?" she asked again. "Where's Jinwoo?" Liam didn't know how to answer that. He picked up Sarah's camera, hoping it would provide some answers, but when he tried to play back the footage, all he saw was static. The files were corrupted, unreadable. Whatever Sarah had filmed on that impossible floor, it was gone, lost forever, and with it, any hope of understanding what had happened to them, and what had become of Jinwoo. The morning after their harrowing experience, Sarah remained withdrawn and traumatized. She couldn't remember what had happened on the impossible floor, but a deep-seated fear clung to her like a shroud. Liam, however, was consumed by a burning need to understand. That he couldn't shake the image of that distorted hallway, the feeling that they had stumbled upon something truly extraordinary, something that defied explanation, and he couldn't abandon Jinwoo. That he refused to believe that their friend was simply gone. Against Sarah's vehement protests, Liam convinced her to return to the Kumho Tower. That he argued that they needed to figure out what had happened, to find a way to bring Jinwoo back. That he appealed to her sense of adventure, reminding her of the incredible footage they could potentially capture, the answers they could uncover. Finally, reluctantly, she agreed. They returned to the tower armed with new equipment. More powerful flashlights, a handheld EMF reader, and a digital voice recorder. Liam was determined to document everything, to capture any anomalies, any clues that could help them unravel the mystery. This time, they would be prepared. They stepped back into the elevator, the memory of the previous night still fresh in their minds. Liam carefully reviewed the sequence of button presses, trying to recall every detail, every nuance of their previous attempt. That he realized that the elevator had shuddered just before the glitch occurred. Perhaps that was the key. That he started running the elevator, intentionally trying to replicate the conditions that had led to the malfunction. That he pressed the buttons, then abruptly stopped the elevator between floors, hoping to induce the same shuddering effect. That he tried different sequences, different variations, all while monitoring the EMF reader and recording any unusual sounds. Hours passed, and frustration began to mount. The elevator behaved normally, responding to their commands without any glitches or malfunctions. Sarah, her initial reluctance replaced with a growing sense of dread, urged Liam to give up. "It's not going to work, Liam," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave this place. That it's cursed." But Liam refused to quit. That he was convinced that they were close, that they were on the verge of unlocking the secret of the Kumho Tower. That he just needed one more clue, one more piece of the puzzle. That he reviewed his notes, searching for any detail he might have missed, and then, he noticed something. That he remembered that just before the elevator had malfunctioned, Sarah had been filming the floor indicator. That he remembered the camera's autofocus struggling to lock onto the numbers, the image flickering. Erratically, he realized that the electromagnetic interference from the camera might have been a factor. He instructed Sarah to point her camera at the floor indicator while he ran the sequence, and then, it happened. As Sarah's camera focused on the numbers, the elevator began to shudder, the lights flickered, and that high-pitched whine filled the air once again. They were about to return to the impossible floor. The elevator doors slid open, but this time, it wasn't the distorted hallway from before. This floor was different. It was unfinished, the concrete walls bare, the rebar exposed like skeletal remains, construction equipment lay scattered around, covered in dust and rust. The air was cold and damp, and the only light came from the weak beams of their flashlights. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It's like the tower is still under construction." Liam consulted his blueprints, but this floor wasn't on any of them. It was as if the tower was building itself, creating new realities within its decaying frame. They re-entered the elevator, Liam frantically pressing buttons, trying to regain control, but the elevator seemed to have a mind of its own. It began to move erratically, ascending and descending, stopping at random floors, each one stranger and more disturbing than the last. One floor was filled with mannequins, posed in lifelike positions, their blank faces staring out into the darkness. They were dressed in outdated clothing, styles from different eras, as if the tower was a museum of forgotten fashions. Another floor was flooded with water, the ceiling dripping incessantly, creating a cacophony of echoing sounds. Strange, bioluminescent fish swam in the murky depths, creatures that shouldn't exist in a building miles from the ocean. On another floor, they glimpsed a scene from the past. Through a doorway, they saw a bustling apartment, filled with people dressed in 1980s clothing, laughing and talking, seemingly unaware of the decaying building around them. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sounds of Korean pop music. It was as if they had stepped back in time, witnessing a moment from the tower's ill-fated construction period. But as quickly as it appeared, the scene vanished, the doorway leading back to another empty, decaying hallway. With each floor, the tower seemed to be unraveling, revealing the layers of its history, its hopes, its failures, and its secrets. It was a chaotic jumble of realities, a fractured timeline, a place where the past, present, and future collided. The elevator was no longer just a means of transportation. It was a portal, a gateway to the impossible. And Liam and Sarah were trapped inside, at the mercy of the tower's twisted will. The relentless shifting between realities began to take a toll on Liam and Sarah's minds. The constant exposure to the impossible, the blurring of the lines between past and present, real and unreal, chipped away at their sanity, eroding their sense of reality. Paranoia set in first. Liam, always the pragmatist, started questioning everything he saw and heard. He began to suspect that Sarah was hiding something from him, that she remembered more about her experience on the distorted floor than she was letting on. He saw her whispering to herself, staring blankly into space, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was communicating with something he couldn't perceive. Sarah, already traumatized by her previous experience, descended further into despair. The shifting realities amplified her anxiety, blurring the line between her fears and what was actually happening. She started seeing things that weren't there, shadows moving in the periphery, faces peering out from behind the mannequins, whispers in the empty hallways. She clung to Liam, begging him to take her away from this place, but he was too consumed by his own obsession to notice the extent of her suffering. Hallucinations became commonplace. Liam started seeing Jinwoo in the reflections of the elevator doors, his face gaunt and pleading. He heard Jinwoo's voice calling out to him from the darkness, begging for help. He knew it wasn't real, but the illusions were so vivid, so convincing, that he couldn't help but chase after them, hoping to find his lost friend. The sense of dread grew with each passing floor. A heavy, oppressive atmosphere weighed down on them, suffocating their spirits. They felt like they were being watched, studied, manipulated by some unseen force. The tower seemed to be alive, feeding on their fears, twisting their perceptions, driving them towards the brink of madness. Sleep became impossible, even when they managed to rest. They were plagued by nightmares, vivid and disturbing visions of the tower's horrors. They saw the construction workers falling to their deaths, the fire consuming the building, the faces of the forgotten residents trapped within its walls. They woke up screaming, their bodies drenched in sweat, their minds shattered. Liam and Sarah were losing themselves, their identities dissolving in the chaotic currents of the Kumho Tower. They were no longer urban explorers, searching for answers. They were just two lost souls, trapped in a nightmare, their sanity hanging by a thread. The tower was winning, haunted by their experiences and desperate for answers. Liam and Sarah sought out the only person they knew who might have some insight, Jinwoo's grandmother. She lived in a small, cluttered apartment near the tower, her walls adorned with faded photographs and ancient talismans. She had always been wary of Liam and Sarah, sensing their recklessness, but Jinwoo's disappearance had softened her heart. After much coaxing and pleading, she finally agreed to speak, her voice raspy and weak. She told them stories that Jinwoo had only hinted at, tales of a hidden history, a darker purpose behind the Kumho Tower's construction. The land where the tower stands, she began, her eyes filled with a distant sadness, was once a sacred place. For centuries, it was a site for shamanistic rituals, a place where our ancestors communed with the spirits. She explained that the developers, eager to build their luxurious apartment complex, had disregarded the sacred nature of the land. They had bulldozed the ancient shrines, desecrated the burial grounds, and ignored the warnings of the local shamans. They tried to appease the spirits with their own rituals, she continued, but they were greedy, disrespectful. They didn't understand the proper ways. They angered the spirits, and the tower was cursed from the very beginning. She revealed that the tower's foundation was built upon a network of tunnels, deliberately constructed to channel the Earth's energy. These tunnels were designed to act as conduits, connecting the physical world with the spirit realm, but the developers, in their ignorance, had disrupted the natural flow of energy, creating a chaotic vortex, a gateway to something else. The elevator game, she whispered, it's not just a game, it's a ritual, a way to open the gateway, to cross over to the other side. She explained that the specific sequence of button presses, the act of moving between floors, was a way to manipulate the energy flow, to unlock the hidden doors between dimensions. The floors that you saw, she said, the ones that shouldn't exist, they are glimpses of other realities, other possibilities. They are fragments of the spirit world, bleeding into our own. She warned them that the tower was a dangerous place, a nexus of chaotic energies, a playground for malevolent entities. She believed that Jinwoo had been taken by these entities, lured into the other side, trapped in the endless labyrinth of the spirit world. The only way to save him, she said, her voice filled with despair, is to close the gateway, to sever the connection between worlds. But I don't know how. The knowledge is lost, forgotten, and even if I did, it would be a dangerous task, a journey into the heart of darkness. But she did give them one clue, a cryptic riddle passed down through her family for generations, a riddle that might hold the key to closing the gateway and saving Jinwoo. Armed with Jinwoo's grandmother's revelations and the cryptic riddle, Liam and Sarah returned to the Kumho Tower, a renewed sense of purpose driving them forward. They knew they were facing something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined, but they were determined to save Jinwoo and close the gateway, no matter the cost. As they re-entered the elevator, they felt a shift in the atmosphere, a palpable increase in the sense of dread. The tower seemed to be aware of their intentions, to be actively resisting their efforts. The elevator began to move erratically, skipping floors, changing direction, as if controlled by an unseen hand. They started hearing whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from the walls, the elevator shaft, the very air around them. The whispers seemed to be taunting them, mocking their efforts, reminding them of their failures. They couldn't understand the words, but they could feel the malice behind them. the malevolent intent, objects began to move on their own, doors slammed shut, lights flickered and died, and shadows danced in the periphery, taking on grotesque shapes. They felt like they were being watched, hunted, toyed with by something unseen, something powerful, something evil. One moment, they would be on a floor filled with mannequins, their blank faces turning towards them, their eyes seeming to follow their every move. The next moment, they would be on a floor flooded with water, the bioluminescent fish swirling around them, their teeth bared in silent snarls. The entity seemed to be manipulating the tower, creating illusions, shifting realities, all designed to disorient them, to break their spirits, to drive them further into madness. That it was a game to the entity, a twisted form of entertainment. They tried to decipher the riddle, to find a pattern, a clue, anything that could help them understand how to close the gateway, but the entity seemed to be anticipating their moves, disrupting their efforts, leading them down dead ends. They realized that they weren't just exploring the Kumho Tower, they were trapped inside a game, a deadly game orchestrated by a malevolent entity that controlled the tower, that fed on their fears, that wanted to keep them trapped in its endless labyrinth forever. And the stakes were higher than ever. Not only was Jean Woo's life on the line, but their own sanity, their own souls, were in danger. The hunt had begun. The entity's game grew more intense, its manipulations more insidious. The elevator became a weapon, a tool for isolating and tormenting Liam and Sarah. One moment, they were together, huddled in the cramped space, desperately trying to decipher the riddle. The next, the elevator would lurch violently. The lights would flicker, and the doors would open to reveal a floor that targeted their deepest fears. On one such floor, they found themselves in a replica of Liam's childhood home. The furniture was familiar, the wallpaper faded, the air thick with the scent of his mother's perfume. But something was wrong. The house was distorted, twisted, as if seen through the lens of a nightmare. The walls were closing in, the shadows were growing longer, and the silence was broken only by the faint sound of a child crying. Liam, drawn in by the illusion, stepped out of the elevator, his heart pounding in his chest. That he called out for his mother, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and longing. Sarah, sensing the danger, tried to pull him back, but it was too late. The elevator doors slammed shut, leaving Liam trapped in his distorted memories. Sarah frantically pressed the button to recall the elevator, but it didn't respond. She was alone again, at the mercy of the entity, her fear amplified by the knowledge that Liam was trapped in his own personal hell. Meanwhile, Liam wandered through the distorted house, his memories twisting and turning, blending with the tower's malevolent influence. That he saw glimpses of his past, happy moments, painful moments, moments of regret, but each memory was tainted, corrupted, turned into a source of torment. That he found himself back in the elevator, reliving the moment when Jean Woo disappeared. He saw Jean Woo's face, gaunt and pleading, begging him for help. He tried to reach out, to save his friend, but his hands passed right through him. He was trapped in a loop, reliving the same moment over and over again, his guilt growing with each repetition. He tried to escape the house, to find his way back to the elevator, but every door led back to the same room, the same memory, the same torment. He was trapped in a loop, a prison of his own making, his mind slowly unraveling. The entity was toying with him, feeding on his fears, driving him towards the brink of madness. He was alone, lost in his own distorted memories, with no hope of escape. Alone once more, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with terror. She knew she couldn't give up. Liam was trapped, and Jean Woo was still missing. She had to find a way to save them, even if it meant facing her own fears and confronting the entity that controlled the tower. She took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. She remembered the riddle Jean Woo's grandmother had given them, the cryptic words that might hold the key to closing the gateway. She pulled out the crumpled piece of paper from her pocket and stared at the words, her mind racing. The riddle spoke of a balance, a harmony that had been disrupted by the tower's construction. It spoke of the need to restore the connection between the physical world and the spirit realm, to appease the angered spirits. Sarah realized that the elevator game itself might be the key. The entity was using the game to manipulate the energy flow, to open the gateway. Perhaps, by understanding the rules of the game, they could find a way to reverse the process, to close the gateway and break the entity's control. She started experimenting with the elevator, trying different sequences, different combinations of button presses. She used her knowledge of the tower's history, her understanding of the shamanistic rituals, to guide her actions. She consulted the EMF reader, looking for patterns, for anomalies, for any clue that could lead her to Liam. The tower, sensing her intentions, fought back. The elevator became more erratic, the floors more dangerous, the illusions more intense. She saw Liam's face in the reflections, his eyes filled with despair, begging her to save him. She heard his voice calling out to her from the darkness, his words fading in and out of reality. She found herself on a floor filled with broken mirrors, each one reflecting a distorted image of herself. Her fears, her regrets. She had to fight the illusions, to stay focused, to trust her instincts. She knew that the entity was trying to break her, to drive her to despair, but she refused to give in. She remembered Liam's skepticism, his pragmatic approach to everything. She realized that she had to use her own strengths, her own resourcefulness, to solve the puzzle. She started documenting everything, recording her observations, analyzing the data, trying to find a logical explanation for the tower's impossible phenomena. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to piece together the puzzle. She realized that the elevator sequences weren't random, they were connected to the tower's ley lines, the invisible pathways of energy that flowed beneath the surface. By understanding these ley lines, she could potentially disrupt the entity's control, to sever its connection to the tower. But it was a dangerous task, a journey into the heart of the unknown, and she was running out of time. After hours of experimentation and analysis, Sarah finally cracked the code. She understood the connection between the elevator sequences, the ley lines, and the shamanistic rituals. She realized that the entity was using the elevator to create a distorted version of the tower's original purpose, to amplify the chaotic energies and keep the gateway open. She devised a counter-sequence, a series of button presses that would disrupt the energy flow, sever the entity's connection, and potentially close the gateway. But it was a risky move. It could backfire, strengthening the entity's control or unleashing something even more dangerous. As she prepared to enter the counter-sequence, the elevator shuddered violently and stopped. The doors opened to reveal a floor unlike any she had seen before. It was a vast, cavernous space, filled with swirling mists and shimmering lights. The air crackled with energy, and the ground seemed to pulsate beneath her feet. In the center of the space, she saw Liam, suspended in mid-air, his body contorted, his eyes wide with terror. He was surrounded by shadowy figures, whispering taunts, draining his life force. And then, she saw it, the entity. It was a shapeless mass of darkness, a swirling vortex of chaotic energy. It had no form, no face, but she could feel its presence, its malevolence, its hunger. "You cannot stop me," the entity boomed, its voice echoing through the cavernous space. "This tower is mine, these souls are mine, you cannot break my control." Sarah stood her ground, her fear replaced by a steely determination. "You're wrong," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "This tower belongs to the people who built it, to the spirits who protect it, and I'm going to take it back." The entity laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down her spine. "You are just a mortal, a speck of dust, you cannot comprehend my power." "Maybe not," Sarah said, "but I understand the rules of the game." She stepped into the elevator and began to enter the counter-sequence, her fingers flying across the buttons. The entity roared in anger, unleashing its power. The tower shook, the lights flickered, and the shadowy figures closed in on Liam, their whispers growing louder, more menacing. As Sarah entered the final button press, the elevator doors slammed shut, trapping her inside. The elevator began to move, ascending rapidly, towards an unknown destination. She was alone, facing the entity, her fate. Hanging in the balance, the game had reached its final stage. A holographic display appeared inside the elevator, showing a series of flashing floor numbers. A voice, distorted and menacing, echoed around her. To save your friend, you must complete the sequence. Choose wisely, or he will be lost forever. It was the entity's final challenge, a puzzle based on the elevator game, a test of her knowledge, her courage, and her will. Sarah stared at the holographic display, her mind racing. The flashing floor numbers seemed to pulse with the entity's power, their sequence shifting and changing, mocking her attempts to decipher them. She realized that the numbers weren't just random, they were connected to the ley lines, to the shamanistic rituals, to the tower's hidden history. She closed her eyes, focusing on the riddle, on the words of Jean Wu's grandmother. She remembered the stories of balance, of harmony, of the need to restore the connection between worlds. She realized that the correct sequence wasn't about opening doors, but about closing them, about severing the connection, about restoring the balance. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the display. She began to enter the sequence, her fingers moving with newfound confidence, her movements guided by intuition and knowledge. She pressed the buttons, one by one, her heart pounding with each press. As she entered the final number, the elevator shuddered violently, the holographic display flickered and died, and the elevator plunged into darkness. She felt a surge of energy, a wave of power, washing over her, cleansing her, purifying her. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the cavernous space once more, but this time, the swirling mists and shimmering lights were gone. The space was empty, silent, still. The entity was gone. She saw Liam, lying on the floor, unconscious but alive. The shadowy figures had vanished. She rushed to his side, checking his pulse, his breathing. That he was weak, but he was alive. She managed to drag him back to the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator descended smoothly, silently, without any glitches or malfunctions. It was as if the tower had returned to normal, its chaotic energy subdued. As they reached the lobby, they were met by a familiar face. Jean Wu. He was standing near the entrance, his eyes filled with relief. He rushed towards them, embracing them both. I don't know what happened, he said, his voice trembling. I just woke up here, a few minutes ago. I don't remember anything. They had done it. They had saved Jean Wu. They had rescued Liam. They had confronted the entity and won. But they knew that their lives would never be the same. They had seen things that no one should ever see. They had faced horrors that no one should ever face. They stumbled out of the tower, blinking in the morning light. The Kumho Tower loomed behind them, a silent, decaying monument to broken dreams and forgotten secrets. They didn't know if they had truly sealed the gateway, if they had prevented others from falling victim to the elevator game, but they knew that they had done everything they could. The morning sun felt alien on their skin, the sounds of the city jarring after the oppressive silence of the tower. They stood together, the three of them, forever bound by their shared experience, forever haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. They knew they couldn't simply forget what had happened. They had seen the impossible. They had faced the unimaginable, and they had barely escaped with their lives. But what could they do? Who would believe them? Liam, his skepticism shattered, was the most shaken. He had always prided himself on his rationality, his pragmatism, his ability to find logical explanations for everything, but the Kumho Tower had defied all logic, all reason. He struggled to reconcile what he had seen with his understanding of the world. Sarah, her thirst for adventure quenched, was grappling with the trauma of her experience. She had craved the thrill of the unknown, but she had found something far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. She knew that she could never return to her old life, that she would always carry the scars of the tower within her. Jean Wu, his connection to the spirit world strengthened, felt a profound sense of responsibility. He knew that the tower was still a danger, that the gateway could be reopened, that others could fall victim to the entity's game. He felt compelled to protect the tower, to guard its secrets, to prevent others from making the same mistakes. They debated what to do. Should they reveal what they had found, to warn others about the dangers of the Kumho Tower, or should they keep the secret, to protect themselves, to prevent panic, to avoid ridicule? They knew that no one would believe them. They had no proof, no evidence, only their memories, their fears, their shared trauma. They imagined the headlines, the ridicule, the accusations of insanity. In the end, they decided to keep the secret. They agreed to never speak of their experience, to bury the memories deep within their minds, to move on with their lives, but they knew that they could never truly escape the Kumho Tower. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for them to return. Years passed. Liam tried to rebuild his life, to find a new purpose, a new meaning. Sarah abandoned her YouTube channel, seeking solace in therapy and medication. Jinwoo dedicated his life to protecting the tower, performing ancient rituals, appeasing the spirits, guarding its secrets. One night, Liam found himself drawn back to the Kumho Tower. He stood across the street, staring at its looming silhouette, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw a light flickering in one of the upper floors, a faint, eerie glow. He saw a figure standing near the elevator shaft, their face obscured by shadows. He knew that the game wasn't over. The tower was still active. The entity was still there, waiting, watching. The nightmare continued. Final shot. A close-up on the elevator floor indicator, showing the numbers 4-2-6-2-10-5 begin to dimly illuminate. The humble Toyabe National Forest sprawls across the rugged heart of Nevada, a vast expanse of sagebrush, juniper, and towering pines clinging to the slopes of ancient mountains. It's a place where the silence can be deafening, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. Deep within this wilderness, far from marked trails and ranger stations, lies a secret, a whisper passed between seasoned hikers and backcountry enthusiasts, the legend of the vanishing cabin. This isn't your typical abandoned homestead, slowly succumbing to the elements. This cabin is an anomaly, a geographic phantom. It appears, then disappears from even the most detailed topographical maps. Some claim it's a trick of the light, a geological formation that resembles a structure from a distance. Others whisper of surveying errors, attributing its inconsistent presence to outdated or inaccurate cartography. But those who have stumbled upon it, who have dared to spend a night within its weathered walls, tell a far more unsettling tale. They return from the wilderness changed, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. They speak of an oppressive atmosphere, a palpable sense of unease that settles over the area as dusk descends. They describe a cabin that seems older than time itself, its timbers warped and groaning under the weight of unseen forces. The wood is rough, aged silver by the sun and wind, and the windows are dark, like vacant eyes staring into the soul. But it's not the cabin's appearance that truly terrifies these unfortunate souls. It's what they claim to hear. As the night deepens, a low, rhythmic chanting begins, seemingly emanating from the very ground beneath their feet. The chanting is ancient, guttural, and utterly incomprehensible, yet it carries a weight of sorrow and despair that chills the bone. And then there are the voices, disembodied whispers that weave through the chanting, pleading, begging, lamenting. They are voices of men, women, and even children, all speaking at once in a cacophony of anguish. But amidst the chaos, one phrase stands out, repeated over and over in a chorus of desperation: "Don't leave us." The locals, those who live on the fringes of the forest, know the legend well. They avoid the area, whispering of ancient rituals, forgotten tragedies, and restless spirits trapped between worlds. They say the cabin is a gateway, a place where the veil between the living and the dead is thin. Some believe it was built on sacred ground, disturbed by early settlers who unleashed something they couldn't control. Others claim it's a prison, holding captive the souls of those who met a violent end. Within its walls, whatever the truth may be, the legend of the vanishing cabin persists, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lie hidden within the vast, untamed wilderness of Nevada. It is a place where the map ends and the nightmare begins, and it is a place that draws the curious, the skeptical, and the adventurous, often with terrifying consequences, and so, the legend persists. Whispered around campfires and shared in hushed tones on online hiking forums, the vanishing cabin. A chilling enigma nestled in the heart of Nevada's wilderness. It's a story that draws certain types of people, those who thrive on the unknown, those who seek to debunk the supernatural, and those who simply crave an adventure that pushes them to their limits. Among these were Sarah and Mark. Sarah, a geologist by trade, approached the world with a scientific rigor that bordered on skepticism. She trusted facts, evidence, and the cold, hard data of the earth beneath her feet. Ghosts, demons, and haunted cabins were, in her mind, the stuff of campfire stories, fueled by overactive imaginations and a healthy dose of fear. Yet, a part of her, a small, almost imperceptible part, was intrigued. The inconsistencies in the maps, the unwavering conviction in the voices of those who claimed to have experienced the unexplainable, it all presented a puzzle she couldn't quite ignore. Mark, on the other hand, was a more romantic soul. A freelance photographer with a penchant for the dramatic. He saw the world through a lens of beauty and mystery. He wasn't necessarily a believer in the supernatural, but he was open to the possibility, eager to witness something that defied explanation. He relished the thrill of the unknown, the adrenaline rush of venturing into uncharted territory, both physical and metaphysical. He envisioned capturing the cabin on film, its weathered timbers bathed in the ethereal glow of moonlight, a tangible representation of the legend. They were an unlikely pair, perhaps, but their shared love of hiking and their complementary personalities made them ideal partners for this particular expedition. Sarah's pragmatism would keep them grounded, while Mark's enthusiasm would fuel their journey. They had spent weeks researching the cabin, scouring old maps, reading first-hand accounts, and plotting a course that would take them deep into the humble Toyabe National Forest. "It's probably just an old miner's shack that's been misidentified on a few maps," Sarah had said, her voice laced with a hint of amusement. "But hey, even if it's just a pile of rotting wood, the hike will be worth it. The scenery out there is incredible." Mark had grinned, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Or maybe," he'd countered, "we'll finally get to see a real ghost. Imagine the photo ops." They both knew, however, that this was more than just a hike. It was a test, a challenge to their beliefs and their understanding of the world. They were venturing into a place where the boundaries between reality and imagination seemed to blur, a place where the legends whispered in the wind held a strange and unsettling power. Their packs were loaded, their boots were laced, and their hearts were filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. They were ready to face the vanishing cabin, to confront the mystery head-on, and to discover the truth that lay hidden within the heart of the Nevada wilderness. Little did they know, the wilderness was ready for them too. The first few miles were deceptively easy. The trail, though unmaintained, was still discernible, a faint scar etched into the landscape by the passage of previous hikers, or perhaps something else entirely. The sun beat down on them, the dry air stinging their lungs with each breath. The scenery, as Sarah had predicted, was breathtaking. Towering pines cast long shadows across the sagebrush-covered hills, and in the distance, snow-capped peaks pierced the azure sky. Mark, ever the photographer, stopped frequently to capture the beauty around them. He snapped photos of the wildflowers that dotted the trail, the majestic hawks soaring overhead, and the panoramic vistas that stretched as far as the eye could see. Sarah, on the other hand, focused on the terrain, studying the rock formations, analyzing the soil, and noting the changes in vegetation. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the trail began to disappear, swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. They relied on their compass and the GPS coordinates they had painstakingly compiled from various sources, each one slightly different from the last. A sense of isolation began to creep in, a feeling of being utterly alone in a vast and unforgiving landscape. The cheerful chatter that had filled the first few miles gradually subsided, replaced by a tense silence. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the rustling of the wind through the trees. Even the wildlife seemed to have vanished, leaving them in an eerie and unsettling quiet. Sarah noticed a change in Mark's demeanor. The playful banter had ceased, and his eyes, usually bright with enthusiasm, were now clouded with a hint of apprehension that he still took photos. But the joy seemed to have drained from his movements. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated for a moment, then forced a smile. "Yeah, it's getting a little creepy out here, isn't it?" Sarah nodded, acknowledging the shift in atmosphere. "It's just the isolation," she said, trying to sound reassuring, even though she felt a similar unease settling in her own stomach. "We're way off the beaten path. It's bound to feel a little unsettling." But it was more than just the isolation. There was something else, something subtle yet pervasive, that was beginning to unnerve them. The air seemed to grow heavy, charged with an unseen energy. The shadows seemed to deepen, to stretch and contort into unnatural shapes, and the silence was becoming oppressive, a suffocating blanket that muffled all other sounds. They pressed on, their pace quickening. Driven by a growing sense of urgency, the GPS indicated that they were getting closer to their destination, but with each step, the feeling of unease intensified. It was as if the forest itself was resisting their presence, pushing them back, warning them to turn around. They passed gnarled and twisted trees that seemed to watch them with malevolent eyes. The wind howled through the branches, sounding like mournful whispers carried on the breeze. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape, they stumbled upon something that stopped them dead in their tracks. A single, weathered raven feather, lying on the trail. It was an ordinary object, yet it seemed to carry a weight of foreboding, a silent omen of what was to come. Sarah picked it up, examining it closely. It was black as night, its edges frayed and worn. As she held it in her hand, a chill ran down her spine, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hike, it seemed, was no longer just a hike. It was something far more sinister. The raven feather felt cold in Sarah's hand, a stark contrast to the lingering warmth of the afternoon sun. She slipped it into her pocket, a talisman of sorts, a tangible reminder of the growing dread that had settled over them. Mark, his face etched with concern, checked the GPS one last time. "We're close," he said, his voice strained. "According to this, the cabin should be just over that ridge." They pushed onward, scrambling over loose rocks and fallen logs, their muscles burning with exhaustion. The forest seemed to press in around them, the trees looming like silent sentinels, their branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal arms. The wind continued to howl, carrying with it whispers that seemed to mock their every step. As they crested the ridge, they stopped, breathless, and stared in disbelief. There, nestled in a small clearing, bathed in the fading light of the setting sun, stood the cabin. It was exactly as the legends described, a small, weathered structure built from rough-hewn timbers, its walls a patchwork of mismatched planks. The roof sagged precariously, threatening to collapse under its own weight. The windows were dark and empty, like vacant eyes staring out into the wilderness. A palpable sense of age emanated from the cabin, a feeling of having stood there for centuries, silently witnessing the passage of time. The wood was silvered with age, its surface scarred and weathered by countless storms. The air around the cabin felt heavy, stagnant, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. Sarah, despite her skepticism, felt a shiver run down her spine. The cabin was undeniably real, and its presence was far more unsettling than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just an old building, it was a repository of something dark and ancient, something that defied explanation. Mark, equally stunned, raised his camera, his fingers trembling slightly as he focused on the cabin. He snapped a few photos, but the images on the screen seemed flat, lifeless, unable to capture the true essence of the place. They approached the cabin cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of pine needles that carpeted the ground. The front door, hanging crookedly on its hinges, creaked open with a mournful groan as Mark pushed it inward. The interior of the cabin was even more unsettling than the exterior. The air was thick with the smell of dust, decay, and something else. Something indefinable but undeniably unpleasant. The single room was sparsely furnished with a rickety table, a couple of overturned chairs, and a rusty wood-burning stove. A thick layer of dust covered everything, obscuring the details of the room. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like macabre decorations. The walls were stained and discolored, covered in strange markings that looked like a combination of symbols and graffiti. As Sarah's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Scratched into the wall above the fireplace, in what appeared to be dried blood, were the words, "Don't leave us." The chanting, the voices, the desperation, the legends were all coming to life before their very eyes. The vanishing cabin was not just a story, it was a place of genuine terror, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurred beyond recognition, and they were trapped inside. The words, "Don't leave us," seemed to hang in the air, a chilling invitation from the unseen inhabitants of the cabin. Sarah backed away from the wall, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark, however, seemed drawn to the message, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. It's like something out of a horror movie." Sarah didn't reply. She was too busy trying to regain her composure, to convince herself that this was all just a coincidence, a trick of the light, a product of their overactive imaginations. But deep down, she knew that something far more sinister was at play. "We should go," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We should leave now, before things get any worse." Mark hesitated, his gaze fixed on the message on the wall. "But what if there's something we can do? What if we can help them?" "Help them?" Sarah exclaimed, her voice rising in panic. "Mark, these are ghosts, we can't help ghosts." "But what if they're trapped here?" Mark argued. "What if they're suffering? Don't you think we have a responsibility to at least try to understand what's going on?" Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "Responsibility? We have a responsibility to protect ourselves. This place is dangerous, Mark. We need to get out of here while we still can." Their argument was cut short by a sudden gust of wind that swept through the cabin, slamming the door shut with a deafening bang. The room plunged into darkness, and Sarah screamed, clutching at Mark's arm. "Okay, maybe you're right," Mark said, his voice strained. "Maybe we should go." He fumbled for his flashlight, but it was dead. That he cursed under his breath and pulled out his headlamp, switching it on. The beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the room in an eerie, flickering glow. They made their way to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Mark pushed and shoved with all his might, but the door remained firmly shut. It was as if something was holding it closed from the other side. "It's locked," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "We're trapped." Sarah sank to the floor, her head in her hands. "This is it," she whispered. "We're going to die here." Mark refused to give up hope. He searched the room for another way out, checking the windows, the walls, the floor, but there was nothing. The cabin was a sealed tomb, a prison from which there was no escape. As they sat there in the darkness, listening to the wind howling outside and the creaking of the timbers, they began to hear something else. A low, rhythmic chanting, seemingly emanating from the very walls of the cabin. The chanting was ancient, guttural, and utterly incomprehensible, yet it carried a weight of sorrow and despair that chilled them to the bone. It was the sound of suffering, the sound of souls trapped in torment, and it was growing louder, closer, as if the cabin itself was coming alive. Sarah buried her face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mark, his face pale and drawn, gripped her hand tightly. They were trapped, alone, And at the mercy of whatever dark forces dwelled within the vanishing cabin, the night, they knew, was going to be long and terrifying, and survival was far from guaranteed. Trapped within the cabin, the chanting growing louder, Sarah and Mark knew they had to try and regain some semblance of control. Hysteria would be their undoing. Mark, ever the pragmatist despite his earlier fascination, began reinforcing the door with overturned chairs and the rickety table, a futile attempt to barricade themselves against the unseen. Sarah, after a few deep breaths, started searching their packs for supplies. "We need to ration our food and water," she said, her voice still trembling but regaining some of its usual authority. "And we need to figure out what's causing this chanting." They managed to light a small fire in the wood-burning stove, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The fire provided a small measure of warmth and comfort, but it also amplified the unsettling atmosphere, highlighting the dust-covered surfaces and the chilling message etched above the fireplace. As the night wore on, the chanting intensified, becoming more rhythmic and insistent. It was no longer just a background noise, it was a presence, a palpable force that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. Subtle disturbances began to occur. Objects seemed to move on their own, shifting slightly from their original positions. The fire flickered erratically, casting strange and distorted shadows, and the air grew colder, despite the heat from the stove. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Mark strained his ears, listening intently. "I don't hear anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It sounded like footsteps," Sarah insisted. "Upstairs." Mark shook his head. "There is no upstairs, Sarah, this is a one-room cabin." But Sarah was adamant. She had heard something distinct and unsettling, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They huddled together, their backs against the wall, their eyes darting nervously around the room. The silence between them was thick with tension, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the incessant chanting. Suddenly, the headlamp that Mark had placed on the table began to flicker, its beam of light dimming and brightening erratically. He reached for it, but before he could touch it, the light went out completely, plunging them into darkness once more. "Damn it," he exclaimed, fumbling for his lighter. He managed to strike a flame, but as he held it aloft, they both saw something that made their blood run cold. A dark, shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room, its form indistinct and wavering, but undeniably present. Sarah screamed, dropping her headlamp. The flame flickered and died, leaving them in complete darkness, with only the chanting as their guide. When Mark managed to light the headlamp again, the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained, stronger than ever. The chanting intensified, growing louder and more insistent, as if the unseen inhabitants of the cabin were closing in on them. They knew then that they were not alone. They were trapped in a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, a place where the legends were not just stories, but terrifying realities, and the night was just beginning. The subtle disturbances were just a prelude to the horrors that awaited them. The appearance of the shadowy figure shattered any remaining pretense of skepticism for Sarah. The chanting, which had been a low hum, now began to swell, filling the cabin with its oppressive presence. It seemed to seep into their minds, amplifying their fear and despair. "It's getting louder," Sarah whimpered, her voice barely audible above the chanting. "What is that?" Mark, despite his own growing fear, tried to remain rational. "It's probably just the wind," he said, his voice strained. "Playing tricks with the cabin structure, maybe it's resonating in a weird way." But even he didn't believe his own explanation. The chanting was too deliberate, too rhythmic, too intentional. It was as if something was communicating with them, using sound as its medium. The chanting grew in intensity, becoming almost deafening. It was no longer just a sound, it was a physical force, pressing down on them, suffocating them. Sarah covered her ears, but it did little to block out the noise. It was inside her head, a constant, throbbing pulse of dread. "We have to do something," she cried, her voice hysterical. "We can't just sit here and let this thing drive us insane." Mark, spurred by her desperation, tried to think of a solution. That he scanned the room, searching for anything that might help them break the spell, disrupt the chanting, or at least distract them from the terror that was consuming them. That he spotted the rusty wood-burning stove. "Maybe we can make more fire," he said. "Maybe light will help." He rummaged through their packs, searching for more firewood, but they were running low. They had only brought enough for a few hours, not anticipating that they would be trapped in the cabin for the entire night. As he stacked the remaining wood into the stove, Sarah began to sob uncontrollably. The chanting had reached a fever pitch, and she could no longer bear it. "It's going to kill us," she wailed. "It's going to drive us mad, and then it's going to kill us." Mark knelt beside her, putting his arm around her. "No, it's not," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "We're going to get through this. We're going to find a way out of here." He struck a match and lit the firewood. The flames flickered and danced, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The heat from the stove was comforting, but it did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere in the cabin. As the fire burned brighter, they noticed something new. The markings on the walls, the strange symbols and graffiti, seemed to be shifting, changing, as if they were alive. The words, "Don't leave us," seemed to glow with an eerie, phosphorescent light, and then, they heard something else, mixed with the chanting. They began to hear whispers, faint, disembodied voices that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The voices were unintelligible at first, just a jumble of murmurs and sighs, but as the chanting intensified, the voices became clearer, more distinct, and they were saying something terrifying. The whispers coalesced, forming distinct voices, each one filled with an unbearable weight of sorrow and desperation. They were the voices of men, women, and children, all speaking at once in a cacophony of anguish. It was a chorus of suffering, a symphony of despair that seemed to claw at their souls. "Please," one voice pleaded, a woman's voice, thin and reedy, like a dying ember. "Don't leave us here. We're trapped," another voice cried, a man's voice, rough and gravelly, as if he had been screaming for centuries. "Help us escape." "Mama," a child's voice whimpered, small and lost. "I'm scared." The voices swirled around them, a vortex of misery that threatened to pull them under. Sarah, her eyes wide with terror, clutched at Mark's arm, her grip like a vice. "They're real," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "They're really real." Mark, his face pale and drawn, could no longer deny the reality of what they were experiencing. The voices were not just figments of their imagination, they were the echoes of tormented souls, trapped within the confines of the vanishing cabin. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of their suffering, the crushing despair of their eternal imprisonment. And then, amidst the chaos of voices, one phrase stood out, repeated over and over in a chorus of desperation: "Don't leave us, don't leave us. Don't leave us." The words echoed in their minds, a relentless plea that resonated with the chilling message etched above the fireplace. It was as if the cabin itself was begging them to stay, to become a part of its eternal torment. Mark felt a strange compulsion, a pull towards the voices, a desire to help them, to alleviate their suffering. He knew it was irrational, that there was nothing he could do to free them. But the voices were so compelling, so desperate, that he couldn't resist their call. He stood up. His eyes glazed over, his body moving as if controlled by an external force. "Mark, what are you doing?" Sarah cried, her voice filled with panic. "Where are you going?" He didn't answer. He walked towards the center of the room, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Don't leave us," the voices whispered, growing louder, more insistent. "Stay with us. Be one of us." Mark knelt down, his hand reaching towards the floorboards. Mark, no. Sarah screamed, scrambling to her feet. Don't touch anything, don't listen to them. She lunged forward, grabbing his arm, trying to pull him back, but he was stronger than she expected, his grip firm and unyielding. Don't leave us, the voices chanted, their tone growing more demanding, more menacing. Join us.be1 with the cabin. Mark began to pull away from her, his eyes fixed on a particular spot on the floor that it was a small, almost imperceptible crack, hidden beneath a layer of dust and grime, and as he reached for it, Sarah knew that something terrible was about to happen, something that would change their lives forever. Or perhaps, end them. As Mark's fingers brushed against the crack in the floorboards, a blinding flash of light erupted within the cabin, momentarily eclipsing the flickering firelight. Sarah screamed. Throwing her hands up to shield her eyes, the chanting and the voices abruptly ceased, replaced by an unnerving silence. When Sarah dared to open her eyes, the cabin was different. The dust and grime that had coated everything were gone, replaced by a sense of vibrant, albeit unsettling, activity. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else, something metallic and acrid, like blood. And then she saw them, not ghosts, not apparitions, but people, living, breathing people, dressed in clothes that seemed to belong to another era. They were gathered around a makeshift altar in the center of the room, their faces contorted in expressions of fear and desperation. Sarah realized, with a sickening jolt, that she was witnessing a scene from the cabin's past. A moment frozen in time, replaying itself for eternity. The people were chanting, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence that echoed the chanting she had heard moments before. They were performing some kind of ritual, their movements frantic and desperate. And then she saw Mark, that he was standing among them, his eyes glazed over, his body swaying to the rhythm of the chanting. That he was dressed in the same crude clothing as the others, his face contorted in the same expression of fear. Sarah tried to call out to him, but her voice was lost in the din of the chanting. She tried to reach him, but her legs felt like lead. She was trapped, a silent observer in a scene that was unfolding before her eyes. Suddenly, the ritual reached its climax. The people began to scream, their voices rising in a crescendo of terror. One of them, a young woman with long, black hair, stepped forward, holding a gleaming knife in her hand. She raised the knife above her head, her eyes fixed on the crack in the floorboards, and then, with a blood-curdling shriek, she plunged the knife into the crack. The cabin was plunged into darkness once more. The chanting and the voices returned, louder and more insistent than ever. Sarah screamed, collapsing to the floor. When she opened her eyes again, the vision was gone. The cabin was as it had been before, dusty, grimy, and filled with an oppressive sense of dread. Mark was kneeling beside her, his face pale and drawn. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What did you see?" Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You saw it too," she whispered. "You saw the people, the ritual, the knife?" Mark nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "I saw it all," he said. "It was like we were transported back in time." They had shared a vision, a glimpse into the cabin's dark and bloody past, and they knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were not just trapped in a haunted cabin. They were trapped in a place where the past was alive, where the echoes of suffering lingered, and where the horrors of history were destined to repeat themselves. And whatever that ritual was, it was the source of the horror. The shared vision was a breaking point. The chanting and the voices, already overwhelming, now reached a fever pitch. The cabin seemed to vibrate with unseen energy, the very air crackling with a palpable sense of dread. Sarah, her face streaked with tears, was beyond reason. "We have to get out of here," she screamed, her voice hoarse with terror. "We have to leave now, before it's too late." She scrambled to her feet, desperate to escape the confines of the cabin, to flee the horrors that lurked within its walls. But Mark stood his ground, his eyes fixed on the crack in the floorboards. "We can't just leave," he said, his voice strangely calm, almost detached. "We have to understand what's going on, that we have to figure out what that ritual was, what it meant." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "Are you insane?" she cried. "We just saw a bunch of people get sacrificed. What is there to understand? This place is evil, we need to run." "But what if we can stop it?" Mark argued. "What if we can break the cycle? What if we can free those souls?" "There's nothing we can do," Sarah screamed. "We're just two hikers, we're not ghost hunters or paranormal investigators, we're out of our depth." "But we can't just abandon them," Mark insisted. "We have a responsibility to try." "Responsibility?" Sarah scoffed. "Our only responsibility is to survive. We're going to die if we stay here, Mark, that I know it." She grabbed his arm, trying to pull him towards the door, but he resisted, his grip firm and unyielding. "Let go of me, Sarah," he said, his voice cold and distant. "No," she cried. "I'm not letting you stay here to die." "Then leave," he said, his eyes hardening. "Leave me, that I'm staying." Sarah stared at him, her heart breaking. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The man she loved, the man she had trusted, was willing to sacrifice himself for a bunch of ghosts. "I can't leave you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Then you're going to die with me," he said, his gaze unwavering. The tension between them was palpable, a silent battle of wills that mirrored the larger struggle taking place within the cabin. The chanting and the voices continued to swirl around them, a relentless chorus of despair that threatened to tear them apart. Sarah knew that she had reached a breaking point. She had to make a choice: stay with Mark and face certain death, or leave him behind and try to save herself. That it was a choice no one should ever have to make, and as she looked into his eyes, she knew what she had to do. She had to save herself, because if she didn't, they would both die, and then the voices would have won. Sarah, her heart heavy with grief and fear, released Mark's arm that he didn't even notice. His gaze was still fixed on the crack in the floorboards, his eyes filled with a strange, almost hypnotic intensity. She knew that she had to leave, now. Before it was too late, before she was consumed by the same madness that had taken hold of Mark. But as she turned to flee, she saw him reach for the crack that he pried at the floorboards, his fingers working frantically, until he managed to lift one of them free. Beneath the floorboard was darkness, that a gaping hole that seemed to lead into the very depths of the earth. The chanting and the voices intensified, swirling up from the hole like a vortex of despair. "Mark, no!" Sarah cried, her voice filled with a desperate plea. "Don't do it, don't go down there." But he didn't hear her. Or if he did, he didn't care. That he was completely consumed by whatever force had taken hold of him. That he reached into his pack and pulled out his headlamp, switching it on. The beam of light pierced the darkness, revealing a narrow, dirt-lined tunnel that sloped downwards into the unknown. "I have to go," he said, his voice barely audible above the chanting. "I have to see what's down there. That I have to find the source." "The source of what?" Sarah screamed. "The source of all this evil. What good will it do? It'll just kill you." "Maybe," he said, his face expressionless. "But maybe I can stop it, maybe I can save them." He lowered himself into the hole, his body disappearing into the darkness. Sarah watched in horror, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mark," she cried, her voice filled with despair. "Please don't go, I can't lose you." But he was gone. The only sound was the chanting and the voices, swirling up from the hole like a siren's call. Sarah knew that she should leave. She should run as fast as she could, as far away from the cabin as possible. But she couldn't. She couldn't abandon Mark, not completely. She knelt down beside the hole, peering into the darkness. She could see the faint beam of his headlamp, moving slowly downwards through the tunnel. "Mark," she called out, her voice trembling. "Are you okay? What do you see?" His voice echoed back to her, faint and distorted. It's a chamber, he said. A hidden chamber beneath the cabin, and it's filled with something terrible. What is it? Sarah cried. What's in there? But he didn't answer. The beam of his headlamp flickered and died, plunging the tunnel into darkness, and then, there was silence. Sarah screamed, her voice filled with terror. She was alone, trapped in a haunted cabin, with a hidden chamber beneath it, and a man she loved lost in the darkness, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever he had found down there, it was far worse than anything she could have ever imagined. The silence stretched, an agonizing eternity that amplified Sarah's fear. She strained her ears, but heard nothing save the incessant chanting and the faint whispers that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Finally, after what felt like hours, a faint light flickered to life in the tunnel below. It was weak, barely illuminating the darkness, but it was enough to give Sarah a glimmer of hope. "Mark," she called out, her voice trembling. "What did you find?" His voice, when it came, was strained and distorted, as if he were speaking from another world. "Sarah, you need to see this." "See what?" she cried. "What's down there?" It's a chamber," he said, his voice filled with awe and terror. "A ritual chamber, and it confirms everything they said." He didn't elaborate that. He simply waited, his faint light beckoning her into the darkness. Sarah knew that she shouldn't go. She knew that it was a trap, that whatever lurked in that chamber was far beyond her comprehension, but she couldn't abandon Mark. She had to see what he had found. Taking a deep breath, she lowered herself into the hole, her hands gripping the rough edges of the tunnel. The descent was treacherous, the earth crumbling beneath her feet. The air grew colder, heavier, filled with a palpable sense of dread. Finally, she reached the bottom. The chamber was small, barely large enough to stand in. The walls were lined with rough-hewn stones, stained with what appeared to be dried blood. The air was thick with the smell of decay and incense, a cloying mixture that made her gag. And then she saw it in the center of the chamber, resting on a makeshift altar, was a relic. An ancient artifact, crafted from bone and metal, its surface covered in strange symbols and glyphs that pulsed with a faint, malevolent energy, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Sarah recognized the symbols. She had seen them before, etched into the walls of the cabin, shifting and changing in the firelight. They were ancient, pre-Columbian, belonging to a tribe that had inhabited this land centuries ago. A tribe that had practiced dark and forbidden rituals. Mark was standing beside the altar, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. He was tracing the symbols on the relic with his finger, his lips moving in silent prayer. "Do you see it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Do you understand now? They weren't just ghosts, they were trying to contain something terrible." Sarah stared at the relic, her mind reeling. She suddenly understood everything: the chanting, the voices, the visions. The cabin was not just haunted, it was a prison. A prison built to contain an ancient evil, and the ritual that she had witnessed in the vision, it wasn't just a sacrifice. It was a ward. A spell designed to keep the evil contained, but the ritual had failed. Or perhaps it was simply weakening with time, and now, the evil was stirring, its power growing stronger, threatening to break free and consume everything in its path. Etched into the wall behind the altar, in letters that seemed to glow with an inner light, was an inscription. It was written in a language that Sarah didn't recognize, but she could feel its power, its malevolence, seeping into her soul. Mark began translating the inscription, reading aloud in a monotone voice. As he spoke, the chanting and the voices intensified, filling the chamber with their deafening chorus of despair. And Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that they had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined, something that threatened not just their lives, but the very fabric of reality. As Mark spoke the final words of the inscription, the chamber began to tremble. The chanting and the voices reached a deafening crescendo, a cacophony of despair that threatened to shatter their eardrums. The relic pulsed with an unbearable light, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Sarah knew that they had to get out now, before it was too late. "Mark," she screamed, grabbing his arm. "We have to go, now." He didn't resist that. He seemed to snap out of his trance, his eyes widening with terror. He grabbed her hand, and together, they scrambled back towards the tunnel. The ascent was even more difficult than the descent. The earth crumbled beneath their feet, threatening to send them tumbling back into the chamber. The air grew hotter, thicker, as if the very earth was trying to suffocate them. Finally, they reached the surface, bursting out of the hole into the relative safety of the cabin. But the cabin was no longer safe. The chanting and the voices were louder than ever, and the air was thick with a palpable sense of malevolence. "We have to get out of here," Sarah cried, grabbing their packs. "Now." They raced towards the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening bang, barring their escape. Mark threw his weight against it, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it closed from the other side, and then, they heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the cabin. It was a sound that defied description, a sound that spoke of pure, unadulterated evil. They turned to see a dark, shadowy figure coalescing in the center of the room. It was larger than any human, its form indistinct and wavering, but undeniably menacing. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, red light, and its mouth was open in a silent scream. They knew then that they were no longer just fighting ghosts. They were fighting something far more powerful, something ancient and malevolent that had been unleashed by the ritual. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the stove and charged at the shadowy figure, screaming a wordless cry of defiance. Mark, startled by her sudden action, stumbled backwards, his eyes wide with confusion. The poker struck the figure, passing straight through it as if it were made of smoke. The figure didn't react, but the cabin shuddered violently, the chanting and the voices reaching a deafening crescendo. Sarah knew that they couldn't fight it. They were outmatched, outgunned, facing something that was beyond their comprehension. Their only chance was to run. She grabbed Mark's hand and pulled him towards the back window. They smashed the glass with the poker, shattering it into a million pieces. They climbed through the jagged opening, heedless of the cuts and scrapes. They were outside, in the darkness, but they were far from safe. The chanting and the voices followed them, swirling around them like a storm. The trees seemed to reach out to them, their branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal arms. The ground beneath their feet was uneven and treacherous, making their escape all the more difficult. They ran blindly through the forest, their lungs burning, their legs aching. They didn't know where they were going, but they knew that they had to get away from the cabin, away from the evil that lurked within its walls. They could feel the presence behind them, a dark and malevolent force that was slowly but surely closing in. The air grew colder, the shadows deepened, and the silence was broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the incessant chanting. The landscape seemed to turn against them. The trail disappeared, swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. The trees blocked their path, their branches tearing at their clothes. The ground sloped downwards, leading them deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest. They stumbled and fell, their bodies bruised and battered. But they kept running, driven by a primal instinct to survive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the edge of the forest. They stumbled out onto a dirt road, their bodies exhausted, their minds shattered. They didn't stop running until they reached the nearest town, a small, isolated community nestled in the foothills of the mountains. They collapsed in front of the sheriff's office, their bodies trembling, their eyes wide with terror. They tried to explain what had happened, but their words sounded like the ramblings of lunatics. The sheriff, a grizzled old man with a skeptical eye, listened patiently to their story, but he clearly didn't believe them. He promised to investigate, but Sarah knew that he wouldn't find anything. The cabin would be gone, vanished from the maps once more, leaving no trace of its existence. They spent the night in a cheap motel, haunted by nightmares and the incessant chanting. They knew that they were forever changed by what they had experienced. they had glimpsed a world that was beyond human comprehension, a world of darkness and evil that lurked beneath the surface of reality. The next day, they tried to report their experience to the authorities, but they were met with disbelief and ridicule. One official even subtly warned them to remain silent, hinting at powerful forces that were best left undisturbed. They realized then that they were alone. No one would believe them. No one would help them. They were trapped in a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights, haunted memories, and gnawing doubt. They returned to their lives, but they were no longer the same. The world seemed different, tainted by the darkness they had witnessed. Sarah, the skeptical geologist, struggled to reconcile what she had seen and heard with her previous understanding of the world. She tried to rationalize it, to find a scientific explanation for the chanting, the voices, the shadowy figure, but she couldn't. The experience had shattered her worldview, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty. She found herself poring over books on ancient history, mythology, and the paranormal, searching for answers, for some kind of framework to explain what had happened. But the more she learned, the more confused she became. The world was far more complex and mysterious than she had ever imagined. Mark, the adventurous photographer, was equally traumatized, but in a different way. That he was plagued by guilt and regret, haunted by the memory of the souls trapped within the cabin. He felt responsible for what had happened, as if he had somehow unleashed the evil that now threatened to consume them. He became obsessed with the vanishing cabin, spending hours online, searching for information, for any clue that might help him understand what they had faced. He contacted paranormal investigators, psychics, and historians, seeking their advice and guidance, but no one could offer him any solace. Their relationship, already strained by the events in the cabin, began to unravel. Sarah couldn't understand Mark's obsession, his willingness to delve deeper into the darkness. She just wanted to forget, to put the experience behind her and move on with her life. Mark, on the other hand, couldn't let it go. He felt compelled to return to the cabin, to confront the evil that lurked within its walls, to somehow make amends for what had happened. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Sarah packed her bags and left. She couldn't take it anymore. She needed to escape the darkness, to find some semblance of peace and normalcy. Mark didn't try to stop her. He knew that she was right. They were on different paths, heading in different directions. The vanishing cabin had changed them both, irrevocably. Sarah tried to rebuild her life, to reclaim her sense of normalcy. She returned to her work, her friends, her hobbies, but the memory of the cabin lingered, a dark shadow that followed her wherever she went. She found herself jumping at shadows, hearing whispers in the wind, seeing fleeting glimpses of the shadowy figure in her dreams. She knew that she would never truly be free of the cabin, that it would haunt her for the rest of her days. Mark, consumed by his obsession, disappeared. He sold his possessions, quit his job, and vanished into the wilderness, determined to confront the evil that lurked within the vanishing cabin. Sarah never saw him again, but she often wondered what had become of him, if he had ever found peace, or if he had been consumed by the darkness. And in the end, was it Sarah that left Mark behind, or was it Mark that left Sarah behind? Years passed. Sarah tried to move on, to build a life free from the shadow of the vanishing cabin. She returned to her work, traveled the world, and even found love again. But the memory of Mark, and the horrors they had faced, never truly faded. Sometimes, late at night, she would find herself staring at maps of Nevada, searching for the location of the cabin. But it was never there. It had vanished from the maps once more, as if it had never existed. She often wondered if it had all been a dream, a shared hallucination fueled by exhaustion, isolation, and the power of suggestion. Perhaps the local legends had simply played tricks on their minds, conjuring a supernatural experience from the depths of their subconscious. But then she would remember the chilling message on the wall, the chanting and the voices, the shadowy figure, the relic in the hidden chamber. And she knew that it had been real. Something terrible had happened in that cabin, something that defied explanation. The truth of the vanishing cabin remained elusive, shrouded in mystery and speculation. Was it a place of genuine paranormal activity, a gateway to another dimension, a prison for tormented souls? Or was it a psychological phenomenon, a manifestation of the collective fears and anxieties of those who dared to venture into the wilderness? Perhaps it was a combination of both. Perhaps the cabin was a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, a place where the power of the mind could conjure supernatural experiences from the depths of the unconscious. Whatever the truth may be, the legend of the vanishing cabin persisted, passed down from one generation to the next, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lie hidden within the vast, untamed wilderness of Nevada. Some say that the cabin reappears from time to time, luring unsuspecting hikers into its web of darkness and despair. Others say that it remains hidden, waiting for the right moment to unleash its evil upon the world. And some say that Mark still wanders the forest, searching for a way to break the cycle, to free the souls trapped within the cabin, to finally find peace. Sarah never returned to the humble Toyabe National Forest. She couldn't bring herself to face the place that had changed her life forever, but she often thought about the cabin, and about Mark, and about the darkness that lurked within its walls, and she knew that as long as the legend of the vanishing cabin persisted, the evil would never truly be contained, that it would linger, waiting for its chance to escape, to claim new victims, to perpetuate its reign of terror. The vanishing cabin. A place of mystery, a place of fear, a place where the map ends and the nightmare begins, and a place that, perhaps, is best left undisturbed. But the question remains, can such a place ever really be left undisturbed? And if it can't, what will be unleashed when it returns? The assignment. Yazoo City. Sarah echoed, the word tasting like grit in her mouth. Mr. Peterson, her editor, leaned back in his creaky chair, the afternoon light catching the dust motes dancing in his office. That's right, Yazoo City. Think you can handle it, Devereux? Sarah hated that condescending tone. Handle what, exactly? Chasing ghosts in the Mississippi Delta. Peterson steepled his fingers, a gesture she knew meant he was prepared to be annoyingly patient. The paper needs a feature piece, something with a little local flavor, the Yazoo City witch, the curse, all that jazz. You're serious? Sarah's eyebrow arched high enough to threaten her hairline. You want me, a seasoned journalist, to write about a fairy tale? Seasoned journalist who hasn't broken a real story in months, Peterson countered, his smile sharp. Look, Sarah, circulation is down. We need something to grab people's attention, and honestly, you could use a change of scenery, get out of this city for a while. He had a point, and she knew it. New Orleans had started to feel like a cage lately, the humidity and the shadows pressing in on her. But Yazoo City, which curses, it felt like a step backward, a surrender to sensationalism. What's the angle? She asked, resigned. Besides scaring old ladies? That's for you to find out, Peterson said, handing her a file. Local legends, newspaper clippings, some interviews we pulled from the archives. Do some digging, see if there's anything real beneath the, shall we say, folklore. Sarah took the file, its weight surprisingly substantial. And if there isn't? Then you write a charming piece about the power of local myths and the enduring appeal of the supernatural, Peterson said, waving his hand dismissively. Just make it sing, Devereux, make them believe, even if you don't. Back at her apartment, the file sat on her kitchen table like an unwelcome guest. The air hung heavy with the scent of stale coffee and unfulfilled ambition. Sarah opened the file, the musty smell of old paper filling her nostrils. Newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, told the tale of the Yazoo City witch. The story was always the same, a woman accused of witchcraft in the 1800s, hunted and killed. Her dying curse promising fire and ruin to the town, the Great Fire of 1904, which decimated Yazoo City, was always attributed to her vengeance. A broken chain on her grave was seen as proof of her escape. Sarah skimmed through the articles, her skepticism growing with each line. Superstition, fear, mass hysteria. She'd seen it all before. People needed someone to blame, something to explain the inexplicable. A convenient curse served the purpose nicely. She pulled up Yazoo City on her laptop, the screen glowing in the dim room. A small town, nestled in the heart of the Mississippi Delta, cotton fields, catfish farms, and a history steeped in the dark legacy of the South. It looked unremarkable, ordinary, and yet, this sleepy little town was the epicenter of a century-old legend. Sarah found a local historical society website and started digging deeper. She learned about the town's early days as a trading post, its struggles through the Civil War, its slow recovery in the face of economic hardship. There was a palpable sense of melancholy, a feeling of being left behind. She found mentions of the Glenwood Cemetery, where the witch was supposedly buried, reports of strange occurrences, unexplained noises, flickering lights, teenagers daring each other to spend the night near the grave, tourists seeking a thrill. It was all so predictable. As the night wore on, Sarah's initial dismissiveness began to wane, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. She still didn't believe in curses, but she couldn't deny the power of the story, the way it had woven itself into the fabric of the town's identity. She closed her laptop, the screen reflecting her tired face. Maybe there was more to this than she initially thought. Maybe the truth wasn't about proving or disproving a curse, but about understanding the people who believed in it. The next morning, Sarah's apartment buzzed with a frenetic energy. Clothes were strewn across the bed, toiletries lined up on the bathroom counter, and a half-eaten bowl of cereal sat abandoned on the kitchen table. She was a whirlwind of organized chaos. Fueled by coffee and a growing sense of purpose, she packed light, a few changes of clothes, her laptop, a notebook, and a voice recorder. She also tucked a small, silver cross into her bag, a relic from her Catholic upbringing, not because she believed it would ward off evil spirits, but because it reminded her of her grandmother, a woman who had always possessed an unwavering faith in the unseen. Before leaving, Sarah glanced at the framed photograph on her bedside table. It was a picture of her and her younger brother, taken years ago. His face was bright with laughter, his eyes full of life. A pang of sadness shot through her, a reminder of the loss that still haunted her. She picked up the photograph, tracing the outline of his face with her finger. "Wish me luck," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As she locked the door behind her, Sarah took a deep breath, the humid New Orleans air filling her lungs. Yazoo City awaited, and with it, the mystery of the witch's curse. She was still skeptical, still pragmatic, but a tiny seed of hope had been planted. Maybe, just maybe, she would find something real in the heart of the legend. Or maybe she would just find a good story. Either way, she was ready to face whatever Yazoo City had in store for her. The open road called, whispering promises of forgotten histories and unresolved mysteries, and Sarah Devereux, the seasoned journalist, was finally ready to answer. Welcome to Yazoo. The Yazoo City Limits sign, peppered with what could only be buckshot, greeted Sarah like a slammed door. Heat shimmered off the cracked asphalt as she steered the rental into town, the engine whimpering its discontent. Gone were the verdant patios and filigreed ironwork of New Orleans, replaced by sun-bleached storefronts and a parade of pickup trucks brandishing Confederate emblems. Yazoo City felt suspended. The air, thick with cloying honeysuckle, carried another, more bitter note, the tang of unfulfilled potential. A peeling mural depicted seemingly endless cotton fields, a stark relic of an era best left buried. Sarah pulled into the gravel lot of the Welcome Inn, a low-slung motel seemingly preserved in amber since the king's reign. The lobby reeked of day-old coffee and moth repellent, cast in perpetual twilight. A woman named Darlene, her face etched with weariness, barely acknowledged Sarah's approach. Checking in, Sarah announced, sliding her license across the worn counter. Darlene exhaled, returning the plastic rectangle. Name: Devereux, Sarah Devereux. Darlene attacked the keyboard of an antiquated computer, each keystroke a staccato burst of aggravation. Room 8. Keys here. Breakfast's at 6, if you're inclined, keep your expectations low. Thanks, Sarah replied, snatching the key. Anything worth seeing around here? Darlene's expression bordered on scorn. Depends on your definition of worth. There's the courthouse, the river. And the witch. A strange brew of dread and respect seasoned the last word. The witch? Sarah queried, adopting an innocent facade. A local fixture. Fixture? Darlene scoffed. Girl, that's Yazoo City's backbone. You can't throw a stone without hitting someone touched by her story. Just stay clear of the cemetery after dark. Sarah arched a brow. Duly noted, appreciate the advice. Room 8 fulfilled its depressing promise. The floral wallpaper peeled like sunburnt skin, the carpet bore a tapestry of stains, and the air conditioner groaned like a mortally wounded animal, barely sanitary. Yet Sarah was too drained for complaints. She dropped her bag on the bed and resolved to reconnoiter. The town square presented a jumbled tableau. A majestic, if crumbling, courthouse presided over one end, its Corinthian columns whispering of Yazoo City's former glory. Across the way, a dollar general and a pawn shop vied for customers. A clutch of old-timers occupied the benches, carving wood and observing the slow churn of life through world-weary eyes. Sarah gravitated toward a pocket park in the square's center. A bronze Confederate soldier stood sentinel, his visage eroded and verdigris-tinged. BLM had been spray-painted on the base, the lettering already succumbing to time and the elements. The park was largely deserted, save for a young mother pushing a stroller and a teenager grinding on the lip of a cracked planter. Something else caught her attention. A subtle but palpable atmosphere of unease. A cramped bookstore sported a handwritten sign proclaiming, "Amulets for protection available." A woman clutching a pentagram-shaped charm hurried by, avoiding eye contact. Even the locals' hushed tones and guarded demeanor suggested they lived under a pall. Sarah purchased a bottle of water from a convenience store and engaged the cashier, a young woman adorned with bright pink hair and multiple piercings. "What's it like growing up in a place like this?" Sarah inquired. The cashier shrugged. "It's different. Everyone's in everyone's business, and everyone knows about the witch." "Does she frighten you?" The cashier hesitated. "I don't know if I truly believe, but things happen here. Weird stuff, and she always gets the blame." "Like what sort of things?" The cashier leaned in, her voice dropping. "Lights going haywire, animals acting up, just rotten luck. Why Grandma always said you gotta give her her due, even if you're a skeptic, leave her alone." Sarah offered a thin smile. "Sounds like solid advice." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting long shadows across the square, Sarah experienced a shiver that transcended the evening chill. Something denser, older, resonated with the accounts she had heard and the atmosphere she had sensed. Yazoo City was a place where yesterday refused to stay silent, where legend bled into the everyday, where the witch was no mere tale. She was a presence felt, back in the confines of her motel room. Sarah powered up her laptop and began to write. Words flowed effortlessly, fueled by the day's observations and an increasing conviction that she had stumbled upon something significant. This was more than just a story of a witch, it was the story of a town gasping for breath, clinging to its identity, and imprisoned by its inheritance, and Sarah, irrevocably, had become ensnared, the keeper of lore. The Yazoo City Library was a small, brick building, its facade softened by climbing wisteria. Inside, the air hummed with the quiet energy of turning pages and hushed whispers. Sarah found Elijah Pritchard, a man whose age seemed etched into the very lines of the books he cherished, tucked away in a corner amidst towering stacks of local history. He was a gentle giant of a man, his hands gnarled and stained with ink. His eyes the color of faded denim, Mr. Pritchard? Sarah asked, her voice barely a breath. He looked up, startled, a pair of spectacles perched precariously on his nose. Elijah, please. Or Eli, if you prefer, and you are. Sarah Devereux. I'm researching some local history. She offered a tentative smile. I heard you were the one to talk to. A slow smile spread across Eli's face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. Well, now, some might say I'm just an old man with too much time on his hands, but I do know a thing or two about Yazoo City. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Have a seat, Miss Devereux. What's on your mind? Sarah settled into the chair, the worn leather creaking beneath her. The Witch of Yazoo. I've heard stories. Eli's smile faltered, a shadow passing over his features. Ah, yes, the witch. He cleared his throat, a low rumble, a dark chapter in our town's history. He began slowly, carefully, as if reciting a well-worn prayer. They say she was a newcomer, arrived sometime in the late 1800s. No one knows her real name. She kept to herself, living in a ramshackle cabin out by the swamp. Some whispered she practiced dark arts, brewed strange concoctions, and communed with the spirits. Others said she was just a lonely woman, misunderstood. Sarah leaned forward, captivated. But what did she do? What crimes did she commit? Eli hesitated. Stories vary. Some say she cursed a wealthy landowner who refused her help. Others claim she poisoned the town's water supply after being scorned. The most common tale is that she made a pact with the devil, promising Yazoo's soul in exchange for power. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the window. Whatever the truth, fear of her grew. A mob formed, fueled by superstition and prejudice. They dragged her from her cabin, accused her of witchcraft, and hanged her from a cypress tree near the cemetery. A chill snaked down Sarah's spine, despite the warmth of the library. And then they buried her in an unmarked grave, but the legend says that the day before the Great Fire of 1904, her grave was struck by lightning and the vault broken open. The fire, they say, was her revenge. A curse unleashed upon Yazoo City for its sins. Sarah absorbed the story, the weight of its history pressing down on her. Is there any evidence to support this? Any historical records of these events? Eli sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. That's the trouble, isn't it? Records are scarce, fragmented. Much of what we know comes from oral tradition, passed down through generations. The local newspaper at the time, the Yazoo Herald, barely mentioned the witch, focusing instead on the fire's devastation. But surely there must be some documentation of the trial, or the hanging. Sarah persisted. Eli shook his head. The mob was unruly. It wasn't a formal thing. They did what they wanted and buried her in an unmarked grave. Some say there were attempts to cover it up, to erase her from history. The town wanted to move on. Sarah frowned. So, it's all based on hearsay and speculation? Not entirely, Eli countered, a flicker of defensiveness in his eyes. There are consistencies in the stories, details that have remained constant over the years, and there's the fire itself. A devastating event that changed Yazoo forever. Some say the date on the witch's gravestone was legible before the destruction, but no one alive remembers seeing it. It was all but wiped clean in the blaze. But couldn't the fire have been caused by something else? Sarah challenged, gently probing his conviction. Faulty wiring, a lightning strike, accidents happen. Eli paused, his gaze hardening slightly. Of course, there are rational explanations, but in Yazoo, we tend to believe in the witch. It's part of our identity, our history. A constant reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface. He looked at Sarah, his eyes conveying a plea for understanding. Sometimes, Miss Devereux, it's easier to believe in a curse than to confront the truth. The witch's grave. The iron gate of the Glenwood Cemetery groaned in protest as Sarah pushed it open, the sound echoing in the late afternoon quiet. Sunlight filtered weakly through the Spanish moss hanging heavy from the ancient oaks, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, felt heavy, almost oppressive. She consulted the hand-drawn map Eli Pritchard had sketched, a tangle of lines and cryptic notes. Supposedly, back near the old section, he'd said, scratching his chin. Can't miss it, always feels different back there. Sarah wasn't sure what she expected to feel, but a shiver crawled down her spine nonetheless. Armed with her notebook, a charcoal pencil, and her camera, she began her trek, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. The newer sections of the cemetery were meticulously maintained, headstones gleaming white against carefully manicured lawns. But as she ventured deeper, the landscape began to change. The stones grew older, weathered and worn by time and the elements. Many were tilted at precarious angles. Some cracked and crumbling, their inscriptions barely legible. The air grew noticeably cooler, the cheerful chirping of crickets and the distant hum of traffic faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. Following Eli's directions, she turned down a narrow path overgrown with weeds. The air here felt thick, almost suffocating. Then she saw it at a simple, unmarked stone, half hidden beneath a gnarled oak tree. That it wasn't grand or imposing like many of the other monuments, just a rough-hewn rectangle of granite, its surface pitted and stained. This was it, the witch's grave. Sarah approached cautiously, her senses on high alert. She circled the grave slowly, observing every detail. The ground around it was bare, almost sterile, as if nothing could grow within its immediate vicinity. The oak tree, though ancient, seemed stunted and unhealthy, its branches twisted and gnarled. She pulled out her thermometer. The temperature had dropped several degrees from the front of the cemetery. She noted the reading in her book, along with a sketch of the grave's crude shape and the surrounding vegetation, or lack thereof. She took several photographs, capturing the play of light and shadow on the weathered stone, trying to document the feeling of unease that was settling over her. As she focused her lens, she thought she saw something move in the periphery, a fleeting shadow near the base of the tree. She lowered the camera, her heart pounding. But there was nothing there, just the oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched. She took a deep breath and forced herself to concentrate. That it was probably just her imagination, fueled by the stories and the eerie atmosphere. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She continued to sketch, trying to capture the essence of the place, the stark simplicity of the grave, the oppressive silence, the unsettling chill that seemed to emanate from the very ground. As she worked, she noticed something else. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound, like nails on stone. She paused, her hand hovering over the page. The sound stopped. She held her breath, listening intently. Nothing. Then, just as she was about to dismiss it, she heard it again, fainter this time, but definitely there. It seemed to be coming from beneath the grave itself. Sarah's blood ran cold. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling suddenly weak. She stared at the unmarked stone, her mind racing. Could it be? Was there something, someone, trapped beneath the earth? She knelt down, placing her ear close to the stone. The scratching sound was clearer now, a rhythmic, almost frantic scraping. She scrambled back, her heart pounding in her chest. This was more than just an old grave. There was something else here, something she couldn't explain, something wrong. Suddenly, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees and sending a swirl of dust around her. The temperature dropped again, and the silence was broken by a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah grabbed her bag and stumbled backwards, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she had to get out of there now. She turned and ran, not stopping until she reached the relative safety of the main path. The sound of her own ragged breathing filled her ears as she hurried towards the gate. The image of the witch's grave burned into her memory, the scratching sound, the sudden chill, the unearthly moan. It all pointed to something far more sinister than just local legend. She had a feeling that this was just the beginning, whispers of misfortune, The dash back to the car felt longer than the walk in, the humid Yazoo air suddenly thick and suffocating. Sarah didn't stop running until she slammed the door shut, the flimsy metal offering little comfort against whatever had lurked beneath that unmarked grave. Her breath hitched in ragged gasps, heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sensible part of her brain screamed about overactive imaginations and stress-induced hallucinations, but the primal fear, the chilling echo of that moan, wouldn't be silenced. She needed to ground herself, to find rational explanations, even if they were flimsy. Back at the motel, she scrubbed her face raw in the harsh bathroom light, trying to erase the image of the overgrown grave, the unsettling stillness of the cemetery. This trip was supposed to be a career rebound, a chance to prove she could still deliver a compelling story. Instead, she was chasing shadows and jump scares. The next morning, armed with a fresh pot of motel coffee and a renewed sense of purpose, Sarah decided to focus on the human element, forget the spooky graveyards for a while. She needed to talk to the people of Yazoo City, to understand how deeply this legend was ingrained in their lives. Her first stop was the local diner, a greasy spoon haven with vinyl booths and the aroma of frying bacon hanging heavy in the air. An elderly woman with a cloud of white hair sat alone, nursing a cup of coffee. Sarah approached cautiously. "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm Sarah Devereux, a journalist that I'm working on a story about Yazoo City, and I was hoping I could ask you a few questions." The woman eyed her with suspicion. "Journalist, never done much good for this town." Sarah persevered. "I'm just trying to understand the local history, the stories that are important to the people here." She offered a small, disarming smile. "I heard a little something about the Witch of Yazoo, thought you might have heard something too." The woman's gaze sharpened. "Heard something? Honey, I've lived it. Why Granddaddy lost his cotton crop the year after they built that Walgreens where the old Elm Street used to be. Said the witch didn't like progress, called it progress anyway." She paused, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "My sister's a teacher, and she had a miscarriage a few years back. She always said it was that witch, said she saw a shadow by her classroom window, right before it happened." Sarah scribbled furiously in her notebook, the woman's quiet conviction sending a fresh shiver down her spine. Do you believe in the curse?" The woman sighed, a sound like rustling leaves. "Believe? I don't know what to believe anymore, but I know bad things happen in this town, and they seem to happen more often than they should." The next interview was at the barber shop, where a group of men were engaged in a lively debate about the upcoming football season. Sarah waited patiently for a lull in the conversation before approaching. "Gentlemen, I'm Sarah Devereux. I'm a journalist researching the history of Yazoo City." One of the men, a burly fellow with a handlebar mustache, chuckled. "History, huh? You gonna write about the flood of 27? Or the witch?" Another chimed in, a younger man with a neatly trimmed beard. "Don't forget about her." Sarah seized the opportunity. "Actually, I was hoping to learn more about the witch. What kind of stories have you heard?" The laughter died down. The burly man leaned back in his chair, his expression turning serious. "My uncle, he used to work at the old cotton mill. He said one night, he saw her, clear as day, standing by the loading dock, said she was wailing, like she was mourning something. The next week, the mill burned down." The younger man added, "My cousin tried to build a house out by the old Black Bayou. Everyone told him not to, said it was cursed ground, that he didn't listen. House burned to the ground before he could even move in, lost everything." As Sarah listened to their stories, a pattern began to emerge: misfortunes, big and small, attributed to the witch's wrath, business failures, personal tragedies, unexplained accidents. The people of Yazoo City saw her influence everywhere, a malevolent force lurking just beneath the surface of their lives. Back in her motel room, Sarah reviewed her notes, page after page filled with anecdotes of misfortune. each one tinged with fear and resignation. The witch wasn't just a legend here, she was a living, breathing entity, a scapegoat for the town's misfortunes, a convenient explanation for the inexplicable. But was it just superstition, or was there something more to it? The chill she had felt in the graveyard, the moan that had sent her running, the stories she had heard today, they were starting to weave a disturbing tapestry. A narrative far more complex than she had initially imagined. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windowpane, causing Sarah to jump. She glanced nervously around the room, the shadows lengthening in the fading light. It was just the wind, she told herself, just the wind, but the whispers of misfortune lingered in the air, a chilling reminder that in Yazoo City, some legends refuse to stay buried, unsettling signs. The fluorescent lights in the motel bathroom flickered again, spitting a nervous buzz that mirrored the state of Sarah's nerves. She glared at the offending fixture, willing it to hold steady as she applied concealer under her tired eyes. It was a losing battle. The light pulsed, casting her face in an alternating wash of sickly yellow and stark white, highlighting the shadows that had deepened since her arrival in Yazoo City. Great, she muttered, snapping the makeup compact shut, just what I needed. She attributed the flickering to faulty wiring, the kind you found in budget motels clinging to the edges of forgotten towns. Still, a prickle of unease skittered across her skin. It had started subtly. A pen rolling off the nightstand in the middle of the night, the television switching on to static while she was in the shower, things easily explained away, yet accumulating like grains of sand in her shoes. Each one a small irritation adding to the growing discomfort. She padded back into the main room. Her notes were spread across the small table, a chaotic tapestry of interviews, historical records, and scribbled observations. The air felt heavy, stagnant despite the humming air conditioner. She glanced at the window, shrouded by thick floral drapes that smelled faintly of dust and mothballs. An irrational urge to fling them open and let in the Mississippi sunlight warred with the equally strong desire to keep the world, or whatever might be lurking out there, at bay. She picked up her tape recorder, rewinding it to a particularly compelling interview with Mrs. Eldridge, the librarian. The woman had recounted a series of misfortunes that had plagued her family, all traced back to a perceived slight against the witch of Yazoo. The librarian's quavering voice filled the room. Sarah felt a chill despite the muggy heat. Suddenly, the tape recorder sputtered and died. She frowned, checking the batteries. They were brand new. She popped them out and back in, jiggling the compartment. Nothing, come on, she said, her voice sharper than intended. Don't do this to me. The recorder remained stubbornly silent. Irritation flared. She was losing precious time. She needed to transcribe these interviews, to find the thread that would tie it all together, the truth, or at least a semblance of it, that would justify her trip, her editor's faith, and her own gnawing doubts. She tossed the recorder onto the table, the plastic clattering against the wood. As she reached for her laptop, she noticed something else was amiss. Her notebook, the one she always kept by her bedside, was no longer there. Panic tightened its grip. She hadn't moved it, she was certain. She searched the small room, checking under the bed, behind the door, even in the bathroom, but the notebook was nowhere to be found. Okay, this is ridiculous, she said aloud, trying to inject a dose of rationality into the situation. I'm just tired. I probably put it somewhere and forgot. But the logical explanation felt flimsy, a thin shield against the growing disquiet. She remembered placing the notebook on the nightstand before going to sleep, right next to the glass of water she hadn't finished. She had a specific routine, a way of organizing her thoughts before drifting off. She wouldn't just misplace it. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She sat heavily on the edge of the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence in the room seemed to press in on her, amplified by the faint hum of the air conditioner. She had the distinct feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting from corner to corner. The shadows seemed to deepen and shift, playing tricks on her vision. She told herself it was just her imagination, the product of sleep deprivation and an overactive mind fueled by local folklore. But the feeling persisted, a cold, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She stood abruptly, needing to move, to break the suffocating atmosphere. She walked to the window and, defying her earlier impulse, yanked the drapes open. Sunlight flooded the room, momentarily blinding her. The motel overlooked a dusty parking lot and a stretch of highway. Cars whizzed by, their tires humming against the asphalt. Across the highway, a dilapidated gas station stood silhouetted against the horizon, its faded sign creaking in the breeze. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the mundane reality of small-town Mississippi. Yet, even with the sunlight streaming in, the unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That she had stumbled into something she didn't understand, something that was now aware of her presence. She closed the drapes, shutting out the world, and turned back to the room. The tape recorder still sat silent on the table. The notebook remained missing. The lights continued to flicker intermittently, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and Sarah Devereux, professional skeptic, found herself fighting a growing sense of dread. A chilling premonition that her rational explanations were no longer enough. The newspaper archives. The Yazoo City Herald building, a bricky, ground-hugging bulwark against the relentless Mississippi sun, held air as thick and still as old gravy, redolent of musty newsprint and dreams deferred. Sarah felt that familiar electric tingle, the huntsman's thrill before the chase, as she crossed the threshold. Here, amidst yellowed documents and forgotten stories, she thrived. Mrs. Abernathy, the Herald's keeper of chronicles, a woman whose orthopedic shoes and severe chignon telegraphed decades of dedicated cataloging, guided Sarah to a storeroom overflowing with crumbling archives. Everything pertaining to the Freeman woman is back here, she stated, her voice devoid of inflection. Handle with care, some of those spines are delicate. Delicate proved a euphemism. The brittle leather flaked away under Sarah's fingers as she wrestled down the hefty tome containing the 1884 papers, the year of the accusations, the year of the hanging tree. The initial piece blared from the front page, Yazoo woman charged with devilry. The prose dripped with melodrama, verging on hysteria. Martha Freeman, branded a crone of dubious character and a peddler of dark magic, stood accused of poisoning livestock, blighting crops, and consorting with the Prince of Darkness. Sarah inhaled sharply. This read more like cheap fiction than objective journalism. Turning the pages, she saw the relentless drumbeat of condemnation. The reporting painted Martha Freeman as a monstrous aberration, a viper in Yazoo's bosom. The trial itself, according to the accounts, was a preordained ritual. Witnesses recounted uncanny incidents, the inexplicable deaths of animals, disquieting nocturnal sounds. All laid at Martha's door. Absent was concrete proof, present was fear, stoked to white hot intensity by the paper's own pronouncements. A smaller article, almost buried amongst the sensationalism, covered Martha's defense. Her attorney, a young man named Elias Thorne, contended that the allegations were rooted in rumor and prejudice, that Martha was merely an unconventional woman who practiced folk medicine and preferred solitude. His arguments were swiftly drowned out by jeers. The article concluded with a curt dismissal. Thorne's paltry attempts to exonerate the defendant were met with scorn by Yazoo's upstanding citizens. The verdict, predictably, was guilty. The execution received a lurid recounting. The condemned sorceress faced her demise with defiant eyes, cursing this town as the rope tightened around her throat. Sarah recoiled, even factoring in the era's penchant for hyperbole. The report reeked of malice, a personal vendetta thinly veiled as news. Hours melted away as Sarah immersed herself in the yellowing pages. Patterns emerged, subtle manipulations that shaped public opinion. Martha Freeman was invariably labeled with disparaging epithets. The reprobate Martha Freeman, the wicked Martha Freeman, the devil's concubine. The Herald consistently portrayed her as an interloper, a pariah, a threat to the community's bedrock. No mention existed of her age, her kin, or anything remotely humanizing that it seemed as though the newspaper had deliberately embarked on a campaign to dehumanize her, transforming her into a fiend ripe for destruction. Sarah sat back, her eyes gritty from dust and endless columns of type. Something felt amiss. The authorized version, as relayed by the Yazoo City Herald, was suspiciously airtight. Too flawlessly packaged that it felt like a carefully orchestrated fiction intended to vilify a woman and legitimize her lynching. What truly transpired? What sins had Martha Freeman committed, or, perhaps more crucially, not committed? A flash of metal snagged her gaze. A small, darkened badge lay concealed within the brittle pages. She lifted it. A simple emblem, a stylized oak leaf wrought in what appeared to be silver. It possessed a coolness, a curious weight in her palm. Sarah slipped the pin into her pocket. She sought out Mrs. Abernathy, her mind a hive of unanswered questions. Do you have any information on Elias Thorne, the lawyer who defended Martha Freeman? Mrs. Abernathy shuffled through a stack of index cards. Thorne, yes, Elias Thorne. A fledgling lawyer, just starting his practice. He left Yazoo City soon after the Freeman affair, claimed he couldn't remain in a place that condemned a woman on innuendo. Do you know where he went? Sarah pressed, her voice a little too eager. Mrs. Abernathy shrugged. The card simply reads, moved westward. That's all we have. Sarah expressed her gratitude and stepped back into the oppressive Mississippi heat. The sunlight bore down, yet she scarcely noticed. Her thoughts raced, piecing together the fragmented narrative, the newspaper articles, the slanted accounts, the young lawyer's disillusioned flight. All hinted at a more nuanced, more intricate story beneath the surface. As she walked, she fidgeted with the oak leaf pin in her pocket. It felt like a cipher, a faint echo from the past, and Sarah Devereux, the ever cynical journalist, was beginning to suspect that the whispers were growing into a roar, hidden truths. Eli Pritchard fidgeted, his eyes flitting across the Yazoo City Library, half expecting phantoms to emerge from the towering shelves. I'm not sure about this, Sarah. Some shadows are best left undisturbed. Sarah, perched precariously on a rickety chair, leaned in, her voice a hushed plea. Eli, you yourself questioned the accepted story of Martha Freeman. You've lived here your whole life. You know this town's pulse. If there's more to it, the truth deserves daylight. He twisted his hands together, knuckles bone white. The harsh glare of the fluorescent light seemed to deepen the lines on his face, aging him prematurely. But what if stirring things up just brings more grief? This town. It holds grudges, forever. Sarah's tone softened, becoming coaxing. I understand your reservations, Eli, but consider it. A woman was judged and executed on mere conjecture and accusation. Shouldn't we, at minimum, strive to learn what genuinely transpired? He exhaled, a sound burdened with defeat. Fine, I'll show you, but promise me discretion. Some secrets are best left sleeping. He guided her through the familiar library, past rows laden with time-worn books and the muffled whispers of the few occupants. Halting at an unassuming section on local lore, he pressed a specific volume, a biography of a past mayor. With a nearly silent click, the shelf pivoted inward, revealing a tight, dimly illuminated passage. Sarah gasped softly. What is this place? The library's complete archives aren't on display. There's material considered unfit for general eyes. Eli's voice was a breath, reaching into the opening. He flipped a switch, bathing the clandestine space in the anemic glow of a single bulb that threw distorted shadows. The air hung thick with the scent of mildew and musty paper. Shelves crowded the walls, crammed with leather-bound tomes, fragile documents, and yellowed broadsides. This was Yazoo City's forgotten memory, the narratives deemed unsuitable for public consumption. Eli moved with practiced familiarity, his fingertips brushing the spines until he paused at a section marked, Freeman Case, Withheld Testimony. He withdrew a thick volume, its cover faded and flaking. "These are transcripts from the Freeman trial," he explained, his voice hushed with reverence. "But they weren't admitted into the official record, they were ruled inadmissible." Sarah accepted the book, her fingers trembling. The pages were delicate, the ink faded, yet the words remained legible. She began to read, her eyes devouring accounts from witnesses who insisted Martha Freeman was a healer, not a witch. One woman testified that Martha had spared her child from a fatal illness through herbal remedies and prayer. Another recounted Martha's charity and kindness toward the impoverished. As she read, a different understanding of Martha Freeman began to solidify, a woman of empathy and knowledge, far from the malevolent sorceress depicted in the Yazoo City Herald. "These accounts, they present a wholly different picture," Sarah observed, her voice barely audible. "Why were they hidden away?" Eli shrugged, his eyes holding a haunted expression. "Power, apprehension, prejudice. This town, it had its fill of all three back then. Martha was an outsider, an anomaly. She possessed knowledge of botanicals and medicine, skills that aroused suspicion, and she was isolated. An easy target." He indicated a section of the transcript. "Read this. It's from Samuel Abernathy, the town physician. He suggests Martha's herbal expertise jeopardized his practice." Sarah scanned the passage, her blood chilling. Abernathy's testimony reeked of veiled disdain and envy. He dismissed Martha's cures as wives' tales, and implied her knowledge stemmed from nefarious origins. "He was consumed by envy," Sarah said, a sharp edge in her voice. "He viewed her as a rival." Envy, fear, it's a volatile mixture, Sarah, especially when spiked with ignorance. Eli paused, his gaze drawn to the dusty floor. There were whispers, too, that Martha spurned Abernathy's advances, that she humiliated him publicly. Sarah closed the book, her mind in turmoil. The sanctioned narrative of the Witch of Yazoo was disintegrating before her eyes, supplanted by a far more nuanced and unsettling reality. Martha Freeman wasn't a fiend, she was a casualty. A casualty of bigotry, dread, and perhaps a rejected man's vengeance. "This is a game changer," Sarah declared, her voice imbued with a new resolve. "I need to delve deeper. Who authorized the suppression of these accounts? Who profited from Martha's demise?" Eli shook his head, his face creased with worry. "Sarah, you're flirting with danger. Some of these families still wield considerable influence in Yazoo City. They won't take kindly to their ancestors' misdeeds being brought to light." "But the truth is right, Eli," Sarah insisted. "Martha Freeman deserves to have her name redeemed." He regarded her, his eyes reflecting both admiration and alarm. "I admire your spirit, Sarah, but tread carefully. This town has a habit of consuming those who pry too deeply." A motive revealed. The yellowed pages of the Yazoo County Land Registry book felt brittle beneath Sarah's fingertips, threatening to crumble into dust. Eli had managed to secure her a quiet corner in the archives, a haven away from the prying eyes and hushed whispers that seemed to follow her every move in town. The air hung thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten stories. She'd spent the morning cross-referencing names from the trial transcripts with property records, a tedious task that had initially yielded nothing but a headache. Then, a flicker, the name, Elias Thorne, leaped off the page. He'd been a prominent figure at the trial, a staunch accuser of Martha Freeman. Sarah traced the name across to the corresponding land deeds. Thorne had acquired a substantial tract of land bordering Martha Freeman's property shortly after her execution. It wasn't just Thorne, though. Other names, equally vocal in their condemnation of the accused witch, also appeared as new landowners in the vicinity. Sarah leaned back in her chair, a knot forming in her stomach. Coincidence? Perhaps, but the sheer number of individuals involved, and the strategic location of the land they acquired, painted a far more sinister picture. she pulled out her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating her face in the dimly lit room. She began researching the historical context of land ownership in Yazoo County during that period. The information was scarce, deliberately obscured, she suspected, but she found enough to confirm her suspicions. Land was power. Fertile farmland along the Yazoo River was the lifeblood of the county's economy, and ownership was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy families. Martha Freeman's property, according to the records, was particularly valuable, boasting prime river frontage and rich soil. A sudden chill ran down Sarah's spine. A prickling sensation that had nothing to do with the archive's musty air. Could it be? Had Martha Freeman been targeted not for witchcraft, but for her land? Was the entire witch trial a carefully orchestrated land grab, masked by superstition and fear? She pulled up a map of Yazoo County from 1878, painstakingly comparing property lines with modern satellite images. Martha Freeman's land, the land that Thorne and the others had acquired, now belonged to one entity, Thorne Enterprises, a sprawling agricultural corporation that still dominated the region. The descendants of Elias Thorne were still reaping the benefits of their ancestors' actions, whatever those actions might have been. This can't be, she muttered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the archive's ventilation system. It's too blatant. But the evidence was mounting, undeniable, the accusations of witchcraft, the orchestrated hysteria, the swift trial and execution. It all served as a convenient smokescreen, obscuring a cold-blooded act of theft. Sarah felt a surge of anger, a righteous indignation that burned through the fatigue and doubt that had been plaguing her. Martha Freeman hadn't been a witch, she'd been a victim. A victim of greed, prejudice, and a system rigged against her. She glanced at the clock. Eli would be back soon to collect her. She needed to tell him what she'd found, but a new wave of apprehension washed over her. This information was dangerous. It implicated powerful families, families who had a vested interest in keeping the truth buried. As Eli approached, Sarah closed her laptop with a snap. The sound echoed in the quiet archive. I think, she said, her voice low, I think I know why Martha Freeman was accused. Eli's eyes narrowed, his gaze flickering to the laptop. He didn't need her to spell it out. He understood the implications immediately. Sarah, he said, his voice laced with concern, you're treading on dangerous ground. I know, she replied, a defiant glint in her eyes, but she deserves justice, and someone needs to tell her story. Eli sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. He knew that look. It was the look of a journalist who had found her story, a journalist who wouldn't be deterred, no matter the cost. All right, he said, his voice resigned. But be careful, these families, they don't take kindly to outsiders digging up the past. He paused, a shadow passing over his face. Especially when that past threatens their future. Sarah nodded, a grim determination hardening her features. She knew the risks, but she also knew that she couldn't turn back. The truth about the Witch of Yazoo was more complicated, more human, than she could have ever imagined, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter the consequences. Escalating fears. Smoke, sharp and fetid, jolted Sarah awake, preceding the strident shriek of the volunteer fire siren. It scraped her windpipe, a ghastly echo of newsreels depicting the blaze of 1904. She scrambled into jeans and bolted outside, where the Yazoo air pressed down, thick with the taste of ashes. An unholy orange glow smeared across the pre-dawn horizon. Driving toward Main Street, dread coiled in her gut, tightening with each passing landmark. A crowd had congregated by the time she arrived, faces lit by the ravenous flames engulfing Miller's hardware. Embers spiraled skyward like demonic confetti against the black canvas of night. Miller's, more than nuts and bolts, it was a Yazoo touchstone. Generations had sought nails, pigments, and counsel within its walls, a material thread in the town's fabric. Eli Pritchard stood apart, his face a study in profound sorrow. In the flickering light, he seemed ageless, A weathered seer witnessing the apocalypse. Another one, he rasped, his voice swallowed by the inferno's roar. Just like before. Sarah navigated the throng to his side. Another fire, Eli, what do you mean? He remained silent, transfixed by the blaze. At last, a sigh escaped him. The witch, he breathed, the word saturated with fear. They say her wrath intensifies with each year, each time we forget. Sarah fought the urge to dismiss it as mere superstition, yearning for the logic she usually embraced, electrical failure, arson, anything but a vindictive specter, yet, the stark terror etched on the faces around her was unnerving. Eli, she began, striving for a reasonable tone, buildings catch fire. It's tragic, but it happens. He shook his head gravely. This ain't just a fire, Sarah. It's a sign. A harbinger. Hours crawled by as the fire raged, finally quenched by the united force of Yazoo City and neighboring counties' fire crews. Miller's was reduced to a simmering husk, a raw wound in the heart of Main Street. Whispers began that day, swelling into a frenzied chorus as time wore on. The witch of Yazoo, they claimed, was claiming her due. The following morning, Sarah was hunched over makeshift office in her motel room, poring over land registry documents, when news flashed. The Yazoo River Bridge, the crucial vein connecting the counties north and south, had failed. No fire this time, no spectacular display of destruction, just a swift, total collapse. A logger hauling timber was presumed lost, his vehicle swallowed by the murky depths. A shiver danced down Sarah's back. 2 calamities in as many days, coincidence, or something far more malevolent. She drove to the bridge's ruins. A scene of manic energy and stunned onlookers. The abyss carved into the road served as a brutal reminder of the town's fragility. The witch's name echoed even louder here, laced with raw panic. Locals spoke of curses and portents, their countenances ashen and pinched. Eli stood as a silent sentinel in the midst of the pandemonium, his eyes brimming with a deep, disquieting pain that he needed no words this time. His face screamed volumes. Eli, Sarah started, her voice strained with anxiety. What's happening? What's going on with this town? His gaze pierced her, searching. You've roused something, Sarah, he murmured, something best left undisturbed. But all I did was ask questions, she countered. Examine old records. Some things are better left buried, child, he said, his tone heavy with resignation. Some truths are too dangerous to exhume. His words settled upon Sarah like a suffocating weight. She scanned the faces of the townsfolk, their fear a tangible thing, their belief in the supernatural reignited. The fire, the bridge, the whispers, they were feeding a communal delusion. Martha Freeman flickered in her mind, along with the land grab, the falsehoods interred beneath layers of history. Had she brought this on? Had her pursuit of truth unleashed some terrible force upon Yazoo City? Sleep proved elusive that night. Each creak of the motel, each rustle of foliage outside her window, sounded like a sibilant threat. The witch of Yazoo's legend had morphed from quaint anecdote to a living horror, permeating the town, poisoning the very air with terror. One truth resonated with brutal clarity. She was no longer a detached observer, she was entangled, a pawn in a game beyond her comprehension, and the stakes were far higher than she could have ever conceived. Confrontation. The Yazoo Herald building felt colder than usual. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter as she walked towards the newsroom, the faces of her colleagues a blur of concerned murmurs. The bridge collapse hung heavy in the air, an unspoken accusation pointed directly at her. She needed to find solid ground, a firm piece of truth to anchor herself to, and that truth, she suspected, lay buried in the Sinclair family history. Beauregard, Beau, Sinclair IV occupied the top floor of the Sinclair Bank building, a monument to his family's enduring influence. The receptionist, a woman with a meticulously sculpted blonde updo, regarded Sarah with thinly veiled disapproval. Mr. Sinclair is a very busy man, she said, her voice a polished monotone. I have an appointment, Sarah replied, offering her most professional smile that it felt brittle, strained. Sarah Devereux, with the Herald. The receptionist consulted her screen, her perfectly arched eyebrows knitting together. I don't see anything here. He confirmed it yesterday, perhaps you could double-check. Sarah pressed, the anxiety gnawing at her, the bridge, the fire. She couldn't let this go. After a tense moment, the woman sighed dramatically and buzzed through. Mr. Sinclair will see you now. Bo Sinclair's office was a study in old money, dark wood paneling, leather armchairs, and a panoramic view of Yazoo City that seemed to emphasize his dominion over it. He rose from behind a massive mahogany desk, a smile plastered on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. That he was handsome, undeniably so, with a carefully cultivated air of southern charm. Ms. Devereux. To what do I owe the pleasure? His drawl was thick, almost theatrical. Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Sinclair. I'm researching a piece on the history of Yazoo City, focusing on some of the lesser-known aspects. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. Yazoo City doesn't have secrets, Ms. Devereux, just stories, and most stories are best left undisturbed. Sarah chose to ignore the subtle warning. I'm particularly interested in the trial of the woman known as the Witch of Yazoo. The smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before returning, even brighter than before. A colorful bit of local folklore, nothing more. He gestured towards one of the leather armchairs. Please, sit. Can I offer you some coffee, or perhaps something stronger? I have a rather respectable bourbon collection. Sarah declined, remaining standing. Your family played a significant role in that trial, Mr. Sinclair. Your great-great-grandfather, if I'm not mistaken, was the judge. Bo leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. My ancestors were pillars of this community, Ms. Devereux. They upheld the law, maintained order. It was a different time, a more superstitious time. They did what they thought was best for Yazoo City. Even if that meant condemning an innocent woman based on flimsy accusations. Sarah challenged, her voice hardening. His eyes narrowed, the charm receding like the tide. Accusations of witchcraft were serious in those days. The evidence, whatever it was, convinced the jury, and my ancestor upheld their verdict. The evidence consisted of whispers and rumors, fueled by land disputes, Sarah countered. Land that your family conveniently acquired shortly after her execution. A muscle twitched in his jaw. That's a rather inflammatory statement, Ms. Devereux. Are you accusing my family of orchestrating a witch hunt for personal gain? I'm asking questions, Mr. Sinclair, questions that deserve answers. He stood up, his imposing frame suddenly filling the space. Yazoo City is a small town, Ms. Devereux. We value our traditions, our history. We don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble, dredging up the past. He walked towards the window, his back to her, the city sprawling beneath him like a map of his influence. Some things are best left buried, Ms. Devereux, for everyone's sake. The threat was clear, unspoken but palpable. Sarah felt a chill crawl down her spine, despite the warmth of the office. Are you threatening me, Mr. Sinclair? He turned back, the charming smile back in place, but this time, it felt like a mask. Of course not, Ms. Devereux. I'm simply offering friendly advice. This obsession of yours, it could be bad for your health, and for the town. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Accidents happen, you know, especially in a town with such vivid legends. Sarah stared him down, refusing to be intimidated. The truth will come out, Mr. Sinclair. Point one way or another. He sighed, a sound of weary resignation. You're a stubborn woman, Miss Devereux, that I admire that, but stubbornness can be a dangerous thing. He walked back to his desk, effectively dismissing her. I wish you the best in your endeavors, but I suggest you find a new story. This one is cursed. Sarah turned and walked out of the office, the receptionist watching her with a smug expression. As she stepped back out into the cold air of Yazoo City, she knew one thing for certain: she was closer to the truth than she thought, and Bo Sinclair was terrified, and that made her more determined than ever. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were higher than she could have imagined. The confession. The air in the Yazoo City town hall hung thick with suspicion. Faces, etched with skepticism and thinly veiled hostility, stared back at Sarah from the rows of folding chairs. She stood behind a rickety podium, the microphone amplifying the tremor in her voice. Slides projected onto a screen behind her showed faded photographs, land deeds, and transcripts from the 1904 witch trial. What I've found, Sarah began, forcing a steadiness she didn't feel, suggests the trial of the Witch of Yazoo wasn't about witchcraft at all. It was about land. A scoff rippled through the audience. Bo Sinclair IV sat in the front row, his expression an unreadable mask of polite amusement. Eli Pritchard, perched near the back, wrung his calloused hands, his brow furrowed with worry. Sarah clicked through the slides, highlighting discrepancies in the testimonies, the suspiciously low prices paid for land acquired by the Sinclair family after the trial, the glaring lack of concrete evidence presented against the accused woman. These documents paint a clear picture: a conspiracy to seize land, fueled by greed and cloaked in superstition, she said, her voice rising in conviction. The Witch of Yazoo was a scapegoat. A man in a Stetson hat stood up, his face red with anger. You're digging up old bones, lady, bones that should stay buried. This town doesn't need outsiders stirring up trouble. This isn't about stirring up trouble, Sarah countered, her gaze unwavering. It's about uncovering the truth. It's about justice for a woman wrongly accused and unjustly executed. The room erupted in a cacophony of voices. Accusations, denials, and muttered threats filled the air. Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was losing them. They weren't ready to hear it. Suddenly, the lights flickered. A low rumble, like a growl from the earth itself, vibrated through the floor. Outside, the wind picked up, howling like a banshee. Rain lashed against the windows, blurring the already indistinct view of Main Street. It's just a storm, Bo Sinclair said, his voice calm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something akin to fear. But this wasn't just a storm. The wind shrieked with unnatural ferocity. The rain pounded the building with the force of a battering ram. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into near darkness before sputtering back to life. Eli Pritchard gasped, his eyes wide with terror. It's like the night of the fire. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The air crackled with an almost palpable energy. The storm mirrored the descriptions she'd read of the night Yazoo City burned in 1904, the night the witch's grave was said to have broken open. A section of the wall behind the podium, obscured by a heavy velvet curtain, began to tremble. The old building groaned under the onslaught of the storm, with a final, ear-splitting crack. The curtain ripped free, revealing a hidden alcove. Inside, tucked away in a dusty corner, was a small, wooden box. Ignoring the chaos around her, Sarah rushed to the alcove. She lifted the box, her hands shaking. It was surprisingly light. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed newspaper clippings and faded ribbons, was a single, handwritten document. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but the words were clear. It was a confession. I, Thomas Abernathy, do hereby confess. I was party to a conspiracy, to falsely accuse and convict the woman known as the Witch of Yazoo, to acquire her land. The Sinclair family orchestrated the entire affair. I can no longer live with the guilt. A collective gasp filled the room. Even Bo Sinclair seemed momentarily stunned. his carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of the revelation. Sarah raised the document, her voice trembling but firm. "This," she declared, "is a confession from one of the men who framed her. It's proof of the conspiracy. It's the truth." The storm raged on, as if the heavens themselves were acknowledging the unveiling of a long-buried secret. Eli Pritchard, his face pale but resolute, stepped forward, placing a hand on Sarah's arm. I always suspected something wasn't right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But the Sinclairs, they're powerful. We were all afraid to speak out." Bo Sinclair finally found his voice, his composure returning with chilling speed. "This is a forgery," he sneered, his eyes hardening. "A desperate attempt to slander my family's name." But his words rang hollow in the face of the confession. The seed of doubt had been planted. The storm, both inside and outside the town hall, was far from over. Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was just the beginning. The malevolent force she had inadvertently awakened was not going to let go of Yazoo City, or her, anytime soon. Truth and reconciliation. Eli Pritchard, his fingers barely steady, nudged the microphone closer. The town square, reflecting the pearly sky in its rain-soaked stones, pulsed with anticipation. Faces, illuminated by the hesitant dawn breaking through the departing storm, bore a shared expression, a blend of trepidation yielding to comprehension. The air, scented with damp soil and evergreen, vibrated with a subdued expectancy. A far cry from the stifling silence of the preceding night. That he cleared his throat, the sound echoing crisply. "Friends, neighbors," he began, the speaker amplifying his voice, a voice seasoned by time and etched with experience. "Yesterday, we stood on a precipice, a community burdened by unresolved history. Today offers us a chance for renewal." He raised the brittle, yellowed parchment, Jebediah Sinclair's confession, unearthed by Sarah from the long-forgotten archives. A visible shudder passed through the assembled townsfolk as they beheld it, a collective drawing in of breath. Near the periphery, Bo Sinclair, his features a study in constrained fury, fidgeted, his usually confident gaze flickered nervously, seeking an impossible escape. "This document," Eli's voice strengthened, resonating with conviction, "is an admission. A long suppressed truth, finally brought to light, regarding the woman known as the Yazoo City Witch." He paused, allowing his words to resonate. Then, slowly, deliberately, he began to decipher the archaic script. The words, scrawled in a delicate hand a century prior, reverberated across the square, painting a grim tableau of avarice, ambition, and deceit. Jebediah Sinclair confessed to the calculated ruin of Alara, branding her a sorceress to seize her valuable land teeming with timber and ripe for progress. That he detailed bribed testimonies, manipulated judicial proceedings, and the cold orchestration of her demise. That he spoke, too, of the ensuing torment, the spectral whispers that haunted his sleep, the constant sensation of unseen eyes upon him. As the recitation continued, the atmosphere in the square underwent a profound transformation. Hardened skepticism began to soften, yielding to a mixture of shock, remorse, and reluctant acceptance. Women dabbed at tear-filled eyes. Men bowed their heads in shame. The younger generation, unburdened by ingrained prejudices, listened, transfixed by the unfolding tragedy. Bo Sinclair's meticulously constructed composure shattered. That he shoved his way forward, his voice shrill with desperation to reclaim control. "Lies, utter fabrications. This is a sham, a deliberate attempt to ruin my family." But his protests sounded hollow, drowned in a growing chorus of disapproval. Those who once regarded him with deference now met his gaze with suspicion and scorn. Even his closest allies seemed to recoil, distancing themselves from his increasingly agitated denials. Eli lifted a hand, silencing Bo with a look both world-weary and firm. That he resumed reading, his voice unwavering, until the last incriminating syllable hung in the air. Then, something remarkable occurred. The wind, previously lashing through the square with violent gusts, subsided. the persistent drizzle dwindled to nothingness, the oppressive cloud cover began to fragment, revealing glimpses of a brilliant cerulean sky. A single shaft of sunlight, sharp and dazzling, pierced the gloom, bathing the square in a radiant glow that it was as though the storm, both external and internal, had finally abated. The purported curse, if it ever existed, seemed to dissipate, dissolving into the crystalline Mississippi air. A collective sigh swept through the crowd. They exchanged glances, their faces reflecting a sense of wonder and liberation. For the first time in living memory, Yazoo City felt lighter, Sarah observed from the square's edge, a feeling of deep fulfillment spreading through her. She had succeeded, she had illuminated the obscured truth, yet, a persistent unease lingered, a premonition that this was not the resolution, but simply the opening act of a new chapter in Yazoo City's long and complicated story. Eli lowered the parchment, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him. This, he declared, his voice thick with emotion, is our opportunity to atone. To acknowledge the injustice that was inflicted. To commemorate Alara, the woman wrongly accused and brutally executed. He paused, then added, it will not be without its trials. Some will undoubtedly cling to the antiquated customs, refusing to embrace the truth, but we must not permit them to impede our progress. That we must move forward, united, and forge a brighter future for our community. The response was immediate and emphatic. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then swelling with increasing fervor. People surged forward, offering words of encouragement and support to Eli. They turned to one another, embracing and weeping, sharing in a communal catharsis. Even Bo Sinclair, stripped of his former sway and influence, stood isolated, his face a portrait of simmering resentment. That he recognized that his dominion was over. That he understood that the established order had crumbled, but he also knew that he wouldn't surrender without resistance. As the town embarked on its journey toward healing, Sarah knew her mission was far from complete. Yazoo City faced a long road to reconciliation, a road paved with challenging dialogues and painful revelations, but for the first time in generations, hope blossomed in the atmosphere. A hope that the town could finally break free from the shadows of its past and embrace a more promising destiny.